Good evening. Calling to order the February 19th, 2020 Bothell Planning Commission meeting. All commissioners are present and accounted for with the exception of Commissioner Peastrup, who is absent and excused, and Chair Vliet, who is on his way and should be here momentarily. Prior to jumping into the agenda, wanted to open it up for public comments for any items that are not on today's agenda.
I think I've made most of my public comments.
If you could state your name and address.
My name is Carol Zeta, and I live on 9th Avenue, which is being impacted by what you guys are planning. And I'm here mostly just to find out how it's going to impact my life and how it's going to impact the road that I live on and the people around me. And I had some questions about 219th, the cut through from Phillips. I had some questions about the stoplights on either end of 9th Avenue. What's going to be done there? How are you going to accommodate on this 1 mile road, doubling the number of cars? What are we going to do? And a lot of the questions were actually answered at the meeting that I went to a couple weeks ago. But anyway, I'm just interested. I'm an interested person, and that's it.
Awesome. Thanks for coming tonight, Ms. Zeta. With that, we'll move on to approval of the minutes. Has everyone had a chance to review the February 5th, 2020 minutes?
I move that we approve the minutes from February 5th, 2020.
I'd second.
All those in favor?
Aye.
Okay, we're skipping through the agenda. I see nothing on new business, public hearing, or public meeting. So jumping into the study session for Canyon Park Subarea, Plan Preferred Alternative Continued Study Session.
Good evening, Chair. My name is Bruce Blackburn. I'm a senior planner with the City of Bothell. I am managing the Canyon Park Subarea Plan update. Tonight we have Rachel Miller with Makers Architecture and Andrew Bjorn of Burke Consultants. And I think what we're going to do, we're just going to jump right into it because we have a lot of territory to cover tonight. And we do have a few little questions at the end that we will be asking you. So you may want to pay attention. Just kidding. But Andrew is going to do a discussion about the market conditions out there. So this is kind of new that we haven't looked at before. So excited to see this presentation. So go ahead, Andrew.
Thanks, Bruce. As Bruce mentioned, I'm Andrew Bjorn. I'm a senior planner with Burke Consulting, and I'm just here to talk about some of the elements related to the plan and EIS that tie into the market conditions on the site and allowable development. Rachel may jump in at certain points about the different scenarios. I'm going to go through a few of these slides quickly because I'm sure that you've seen a number of them before, and they're in here for completeness, but no need to get exhaustive with a 30-slide presentation. So overall, our purpose is really to support the ongoing discussion about the future and preferred alternative in Canyon Park. This presentation in particular is going to look at summarizing some of the economic and market conditions, and then after Rachel's presentation, we're going to go through and identify questions, and we'll also talk about next steps. But there is a few elements of the market study that are looking to be completed right now. Just a few final pieces that we were coordinating with Snohomish County. So that work is pending, but I can share a few of those results tonight. So again, this is an overview slide. I won't go through this in depth, but essentially what we're looking at here in Canyon Park is a regional growth center in the Puget Sound region. It's looking to, right now it's an important cluster for high-tech and biomedical jobs, but this is an area that's also primed for residential development. So what's the challenge? As we'll go through in these presentations, we really do need to coordinate to make sure that growth is occurring in Canyon Park in an efficient and effective way. That we're accommodating both the needs for job growth with businesses in the area as well as accommodating additional residential growth. So the basis for a lot of the work that we're presenting tonight, it's been ongoing for about 2-3 years. The initial vision for Canyon Park was that work was completed in the summer of 2018. That had an initial evaluation of employment and local industries as well as real estate and growth in the area. Now, as part of this process, when we've been looking at sub-area planning and the EIS, we've gone into more detail about the employment and the local market. We've talked about socioeconomics in the area. And another thing that we've done, and I'll talk to this to some extent, is we've done a pro forma analysis to evaluate the feasibility of certain types of development in the area, and a market study just to evaluate kind of expectations for future growth. So Rachel will go into a little bit more detail about this. Hopefully I'm not putting you on the spot for anything. Oh, no. There are a number of different areas that we've been examining as part of this project. The one thing to note with this, as we'll get into this later, the final boundary for the regional growth center is proposed to be that red area. We'll get into the rationale for that later. But we've been looking at a broader sub-area for the purposes of the market evaluation. And as we've been going through, we've also been comparing to a lot of the trends that are currently going on in the market. So looking at office and flex markets in South Snohomish, in North King County, looking at retail and multifamily residential in the downtown here, in some comparable mixed-use centers in the region. And we've also been trying to examine, what the effects are going to be with the SWIFT line that just recently came into play. So that's going to have a significant impact on the potential for growth in the area. Some of that is still manifesting, but that's going to really change the dynamics of that, as well as the 405 BRT. So just looking really broadly at the characteristics of the study area that we've been looking at, right now there are about 1,400 dwellings in the area, with about 5.4 million square feet of commercial space. And a lot of this is in office and flex uses. And this is characterized both by biotech and biomedical uses, which require some of the space for light manufacturing uses. And it's also an incubator. So there are some uses that are in there that are benefiting from lower rents as they're starting up, or are uses that are gravitating towards those types of spaces. Now, there are about 11,000, 12,000 jobs in this area. This is a pretty significant cluster, and development that's going on in this area is notable. In terms of commercial development over Snohomish County overall, for example, there isn't a lot that's going on. This is an important cluster of activity. So, looking really quickly at the different types of spaces that are here. Office rents are lower in this area, and vacancy rates are lower. So there is, this does support tenants that are looking for lower cost spaces. So again, looking at those types of businesses that can use space in Canyon Park as incubator space, or as space that's a little bit more, cost competitive for certain types of businesses. Retail, this is interesting, and this is something to point out. There is not, there's some retail that's focused south of 405 as well as around Thrasher's Corner. But the vacancy rates are lower and the rents are somewhat higher than the broader region. So this does suggest that that retail may be more cost competitive as part of mixed-use development. And then looking at flex space, there is higher vacancy rates here. It is somewhat of a function of there is some variability in the vacancy rates, but the rents here are higher, and this suggests that some of the space is more keyed into light industrial and manufacturing than other types of flex spaces. So looking at improvement values, the purpose of putting this up, this is essentially the ratio between the improvement value on a given parcel, so the value of the actual structure, the building, versus the total value overall. So this is a good way of comparing land prices, which is an indicator of the development potential, with how much development is actually there. So the darker colors that are here point more towards spaces that are currently less likely to be developed, currently accommodate improvements that kind of occupy most of the developable capacity. But the yellow areas point more towards spaces that are either marginal or more importantly, areas where there could be development accommodated in the area. So these numbers may change. There are certain 1 to 2 story office and flex spaces that may that as land use policies change, as the effects of the SWIFT line continue, that land prices increase and some of these areas become more competitive for redevelopment. So looking at job and investment trends, this is an interesting one. So on the left, this is the permit value for permits that were issued from 2015 to 2019. And as you note here, the dark blue and the light blue indicate tenant improvements in the area. And these are pretty considerable. And, for example, this accommodates a $22 million major tenant improvement by Seattle Genetics last year, as well as a $10 million major TI from Juno. So the proportion of new development is somewhat small, but what this generally indicates is that there is significant investment that's going on, especially from current tenants and some businesses that own their own property in this area. So, the Phillips site being another example of that. So that's one important thing to point out. And then as well, and we'll get into this in a minute, looking at a broader context, but generally the rate of growth of employment. So these are covered employment estimates from the state. And looking at it over time, there are trends upwards. So this is increasing at about 3% per year, which a 3% number doesn't necessarily sound like a lot, but it's pretty considerable growth on a relative basis. So just a quick word about development capacity in the area. We were looking at the 2015 Imagine Bothell Comprehensive Plan and the land capacity analysis that was included with that. So right now, and again, we'll get into how this relates to the proposed planning in a minute, but There is, about 4,500 additional residents and 4,100 additional jobs that are allowed in that area under the current capacity analysis under the land use policies that were in place then and are currently in place. And in looking at the draft EIS results, those are similar. We're currently reviewing some of this information. We were coordinating with folks from Snohomish County looking at buildable lands assessments today, and we'll be coming out with more results from that. But looking at employment projections as well and trying to compare them to what we think is going on in the area. So the PSRC regional growth strategy, Vision 2040, the Snohomish County portion of Bothell is expected to capture about 6,600 employees under the 2040 plan, and which represents about a growth rate of 1 to 1.5%. They did come out with the draft 2050 plan, which updates certain growth assumptions and strategies for accommodating growth. But again, in looking at what can be accommodated, and we haven't taken a look at specific estimates for Bothell. These are things that are more estimated at a broader regional level. But for Bothell and Linwood combined in Snohomish County, the estimates are about 2% of growth per year in employment. And these are being outpaced by current numbers in Canyon Park. So looking at the past, looking at 2010 to 2017, especially, this is over 3% growth per year. So this is an area that's experiencing a significant amount of growth, and that's important to note as we're going forward and looking at potential strategies to accommodate future growth. So growth targets, why and what are they? That is somewhat of a broad question, but I know that we've covered this before in previous presentations. The things that are important to note here first, and this plays into the changes in the boundaries of the area, but there is a need under current policy to accommodate 45 people per acre. This includes both jobs and residents. Right now it's currently 17, so there's a need for some level of intensification of development in this area. But what this means for when you consider the areas that we're looking at under our study is that there's a need to accommodate about 13 to 14,000 more people in the Regional Growth Center. We're not looking at doing this tomorrow. We're not putting in high rises and expecting to fill them overnight. This is something that is more of looking forward over the next few decades and how do we accommodate the growth that's expected to be captured in the area? How do we plan it out in an effective and responsible way? Something else to note, because this area is envisioned as a mixed-use center, 4,500 of the, at least 4,500 rather, of the 13 to 14,000 people that we're looking at accommodating in this area would need to be residents. So we're not looking at this as being a job center alone, but more as a mixed-use activity center. So when we were going through and developing some of the initial concepts for this area, there were a number of different typologies where we were looking at ways of accommodating additional growth. I'm only putting this up here for completeness. This has evolved for a few different reasons, but there is a range of different types of uses that we were looking at accommodating office and flex spaces, as well as mixed use, TOD employment and TOD residential uses. And this is important to note as we're going forward and talking about some of the land use concepts that we have. So as we were going forward and looking at the DEIS, we needed to come up with certain alternatives to evaluate the potential impacts of possible growth on environmental characteristics in the area. And through some of the efforts that we've conducted as part of this project, in addition to some previous work, there were 4 alternatives that we were looking at. There were 3 alternatives and then kind of one that sprung out from some of the initial evaluations that we had done. And these are, I'm going to go through these quickly. Rachel's going to cover the mitigated live-work scenario in much more detail. But we were looking at different, how do we accommodate different types of land uses, different mixes in this area, from no action under the current land use policy to looking at accommodating more business, accommodating a more balanced mix of residential and commercial growth, and then looking at kind of changing some elements, some parameters of the growth scenarios to come up with a more balanced land use concept. So, oh yes, I'm going to go through these very quickly. The no action scenario, what's currently in place, looking at Business Plus and Live Work. These were initial evaluations that we had done. There's a considerable amount of new development that's accommodated in here. The final scenario is something that's more balanced, that achieves the 45 people per acre target, but does so with fewer, a little bit less development than what we had envisioned for the other scenarios. So something else that's important to note as we were going through and looking at some of these concepts, it is important to note that there is a need for investment in transportation and park systems. So with parks and trails, there are a number of elements that we've included in here. What I want to just reference is that we want to make sure that the neighborhoods that are developed here, as we're accommodating more residential growth, have amenities that can support support new residents, that can accommodate their needs. So it's not simply a matter of putting in apartments and mixed-use development and that's it, but also providing green space and trails and other infrastructure that can support those uses. And as well, there is a need to accommodate more, kind of build off the existing transit investments, both the current SWIFT line as well as the envisioned future 405 BRT, and look at additional roadway investments to mitigate some of the impacts of additional growth in this area. So I went through those somewhat quickly. This next section I could talk about for a very long time. I'm gonna kind of hold myself back from rambling on for a long period of time about it. But so we've developed a number of different scenarios, and we wanted to try to evaluate what the market conditions were and how current market conditions may or may not support the growth that we're envisioning over the long term. So we were looking at 3 distinct sites and looking at the potential development that could go in under the scenarios, under the new land use policies that we've been envisioning. So for one, we were looking at a residential retail Main Street development on the northern portion of the site near Thrasher's Corner, kind of accommodating this mixed-use village in that particular area. As well, we wanted to look at commercial and retail mixed-use development closer to the current park and ride. And this, part of the concept behind this is that we want to evaluate whether we can provide more services to the office uses that are currently in the area. So developing it out not just simply as as a business park, but something that has more economic activity. And then finally, I moved that back. And then finally, a commercial infill development. So looking at the current business park, if we were looking at intensifying the commercial uses within the business park, what could feasibly go in, and what are some of the limitations behind that? So the pro forma assessments that we were looking at took a prototypical development on these sites that would be allowed through the changes in policy that we're looking at, and evaluated them in the context of current rents in the area, as well as construction costs and lending costs. And what we were looking to do is essentially just evaluate whether these different projects were feasible. So if we were going to go out and put shovel to dirt tomorrow, would we be able to get a return off of these types of investments? So in looking at mixed use and housing, which is something right now which is not, we've primarily focused on this area as an employment center, but the potential for growth for mixed use and for housing is pretty considerable. And the development that we were looking at was feasible. It's something where parking is certainly an issue for more intensive multifamily uses in this area, but even under some of the current allowances for parking around transit, we were able to propose a project that would be feasible. And in addition, we were also able to identify situations where affordable housing could be accommodated in new development through a 12-year MFTE program with some impact fee reductions. So it's something that could be accommodated with the policy options that you currently have. The concern with this, though, is that in the region right now, residential development is extremely competitive. And it's something that in some ways is crowding out commercial development. So there's a lot of dirt being turned for new apartment buildings, not so much for commercial development. And again, I mean, some of the analyses that we've done over Snohomish County, for example, there's been some development of medical office and some retail space in mixed-use projects, but overall, the amount of freestanding office space that's been developed over the past several years in Snohomish County has been pretty low. So in the short term, the potential is that additional mixed use and residential growth could accommodate a lot of space in this area if it were permitted. So building off of that with commercial space, right now these projects are not as feasible. Now, that's not saying that future conditions could not change and change the feasibility of these kinds of projects. So looking at more intensive office spaces, for example, office developments, for example. This area does also have potential because of the current biomedical cluster that's here. So as opposed to other communities that may have 1 million or 2 million square feet of office plan that will not roll out in the next decade or two, there are potential synergies that are here between the current uses and what may go in. And what's also important is that this area is looking to become a transit hub. So the BRT, as well as the Swift line and other bus lines in the area, mean that this area is better serviced by transit and has more potential to support employment-oriented transit nodes. So some of the examinations that we were doing, the other part to note here is that parking is certainly an issue. A lot of the development that's currently here is supported by surface parking, and there may be limited cases where properties that are owned by the companies occupying them may look to develop out parking garages, for example. But looking at competitive office space, this is not necessarily something that's feasible. It's a hard sell to, charge people for parking to recover the costs of building a parking structure to accommodate a larger office building in this area. And then, oh, okay, sorry. And then finally, just to kind of highlight a few things, we've gone over a number of these points, but this is a good way of kind of wrapping up some of our discussion. There is a slow rate of office growth in an area that's identified for longer-term employment growth. This is somewhat of an issue because we're kind of at this point where, yes, residential growth is seen as, new residential development is seen as being a more feasible product on the real estate market, but with the growth in employment in the area, we also need to consider that we do need to accommodate new employment in this center. In terms of long-term trends, one other thing to note here is that at present, this area is accommodating a lot of cheaper office, is accommodating lower-priced office space, is accommodating flex space. This may change over time. You may get other uses that come in and replace the uses that are currently here. That level of turnover is something that's expected and something that should be considered in future development and future planning. But we are kind of envisioning this area in the longer term as being a job center with the potential for live-work opportunities, for greater amounts of services provided to both the employees and future residents of the area. So this provides a kind of an overview. There's more detail that's included in the different reports that we've provided and the report that we're looking to provide soon. Should I take questions right now, or should we kind of? Okay, so if there are any questions that you might have.
I've got a quick question. For the third site, the commercial infill site, what did the pro forma analysis, was that lumped in with the other commercial site that was analyzed, or did that produce separate results?
So we were looking at it separately. We evaluated a site that currently had I'm trying to remember, a 3-story commercial building. Yeah. Oh, actually, that's yeah. I think it's just yeah. So there was a site here that currently had an existing building, and we were looking at, for the parking lot and some additional space that was left over, could we fit more development in there? Because it was occupying parking, we needed to accommodate parking in a structure as opposed to having it as surface parking. It was really that cost that kind of drove things over. There is a market for some office space in the area. There's growth, but it's that surface parking that's the real constraint to costs, because once you go into a structure, the costs increase.
Okay, so cool, thanks.
Okay.
So without a parking structure, what kind of percentage of the developable area will be eaten up by parking lots?
I don't know that number off the top of my head, but if you look at the footprints of parking lots there right now,
Yeah.
that's pretty much, they're maxing out
Pretty significant.
a lot of the space. So, they're not leaving a whole lot left over for additional development.
As a super rough ratio for traditional office park style development, it's almost a 1-to-1. So like for every floor of office space you have the same amount of parking. So if you have a 3-story building, you have like 3/4 of the site is parking, surface parking.
So it's maybe more for the staff than the consultants. Does the city have a trip reduction program to encourage businesses to reduce the trips per employee?
Yes, we do. Actually, we do, actually, and commute trip reduction is also part of that program. And we service through a couple different agencies. One, of course, is Community Transit, who has been actively working with some of the companies within the Canyon Park area. Notably, Juneau, we had a discussion with them, and they've already implemented quite a few of these kind of strategies.
And Fair and Piers is also looking at what other further reductions they can do through Orca passes and all kinds of programs.
Couple of questions. Thanks for the presentation. Good information. I'm wondering if you did further analysis on the total jobs and what the income level for the jobs in that center are now is related to the median income. I know that there's some high-paying jobs out there, and when you start to look at more retail and different uses, the type of job changes.
Yeah.
And I know that we have goals for increased jobs, but I'd advocate for not getting rid of, high-paying jobs that are serving the families in our community now. Was there any analysis on that?
I'm trying to remember. I believe that we were looking at aggregate job numbers and not necessarily the wages of those jobs in this report. I would need to check to make sure. But just to be clear, I mean, we're not envisioning supplanting the office jobs that are in the area with retail. If anything, the retail would be, like, if we're looking at what growth would be going on, and again, I'm pointing to Rachel a lot for some of the answers here, but the policy is pretty clear that we want to maintain and increase the employment in the area, and that the jobs that you're indicating are ones that want to be kept in the community. So a lot of the growth is more envisioned as providing services to support those office workers, and even to, support additional amounts of office employment in that area.
Okay, thanks. And then a couple more. The calculation for, so you had 13,700 is the goal with about 4,500 or more residential, and then we came in just below that total number. When you were calculating office space per person per square footage, what number did you use, or did it vary based on the type?
I would need to check. It changed a little bit on the basis of the proximity to transit, but I'm trying to remember what that number was.
There's a table in the draft EIS that shows all of the activity unit assumptions that we did by zone.
Okay.
Yeah.
I'm just thinking about how dynamic those numbers are, particularly on the east side, and we talked about not a lot of commercial development in the region, but it's really creeping west, and now it's creeping north with the investments in Kirkland by tech companies, and we don't even talk about Bellevue. People in the room know about that, but it just seems ripe for more tech jobs, and if they're 120, 150 per square foot, it just changes the capacity for these developments significantly, and may change what pencils out. So I'd be interested in reading that table.
Yeah, and something else to note, I mean, these areas, there's been sales activity that's been going on in these areas. There are institutional investors that have been taking a look at these sites, and they've changed hands. And that's something that's important to note. I mean, this is not an area that's, this is an area that's receiving attention. And that's, that kind of means that our job here is a little more of a little more immediate. But yeah, I agree, and we wanted to have realistic assumptions that were based on typical numbers that we saw in other areas. So the assumptions that are in that table are pretty standard, and were compared with, for example, the work that's been done in the county on buildable lands and on employment yields. So.
Okay, perfect. And then last question, more simple, just on the map, we have, it's there. You have the Canyon Park Subarea and the Regional Growth Center, and your pro forma analysis for the residential retail took place outside of the Regional Growth Center. Is there a reason why you chose that location?
That's the old regional growth center.
Okay, so that was done before the
Yeah,
adjustment
so we
decision?
adjusted it to include the Thrasher's Corner area.
Okay.
And part of that is because there is a need to accommodate additional residential growth in the center, and that area was really seen as being one potential location for that. That you know, because of the confluence of existing development and a swift stop there, you know, we're not saying that development's going to occur there tomorrow, but it looks pretty prime for mixed use development.
Okay. Thanks for letting me ask all those questions and good answers. Appreciate it.
Yeah.
Well, one question I have is, can the existing underground infrastructure utilities, how does that marry up with what you have planned as far as, can it handle 13,000 new people, or do we have to rip up roads and put new pipe and who pays for that and all that fun stuff?
That's not something that I had assessed as part of this. I'm trying to look for a little bit of help here.
Fair enough. One of the things that we've been doing, we've been kind of coordinating with some of our utility providers. We have Alderwood Water and Sewer, and of course we have Snohomish County Public Utility District #1 up there. Both of them have recently provided some really significant improvements and investments in future capacity, particularly sanitary sewer and electricity. Interestingly enough, one of the things that we're working with the Property Owners Association on is understanding what the condition of the subsurface utilities are, and that's really important that we understand that, particularly the surface water facilities. And we're going to be getting some more reports on that later on as part of this effort. So, yeah, there is a lot of investigation as to what the utilities' capacity is within this area.
Yeah, you have clean water coming in, dirty water going out, where it's treated, that kind of thing. So I was
Yes.
curious to see what the capacity is now versus you're talking about a big increase of connections.
Yeah,
So
and another one that has, of course, you know, is the big Brightwater treatment plant. And essentially that was constructed as kind of a prelude to the very large amount of growth that's been predicted and has been occurring within the South Snohomish County area. And that's correct, yes. Yes.
I believe you, thanks for the presentation. I believe on one of your slides, you said that the office rates are lower in our region, and also the, it's like at 1.4% vacancy, so the vacancy is also lower. So how does is it just because Bothell's kind of a little bit too far away from some of the other areas that I guess in the last 20 years have been maybe more popular hubs? How does that work out? How does it, if there's less availability and it's cheaper? I'm just interested, that seems really unique.
Well, I think, I mean, one thing that we're examining with that is just kind of the general trends. So we're not necessarily looking at the quality of the space. We're not necessarily looking at what it's being used for. There are certainly spaces that are in here that are being used for, you know, office functions that are, you know, Class B or in some cases Class C office space that may be, you know, that are older, that are accommodating, you know, certain kinds of uses that are not destined for downtown, for example. That's not saying that there's anything wrong with these areas. It's just more of that it's just competitive at a different price point. So.
Thank you.
I was writing a note down and I saw another note, if you don't mind, another question. And maybe we're not far enough into the analysis to answer this, but typically office parking lots fill up during the day, residential fill up at night. Have we looked at shared use parking or any types of programs in the corridor to help offset the cost? Because it's, you know, too two people paying for one spot at that rate.
Well, in the pro forma analysis that we were doing of the mixed-use project, we were specifically looking at how shared parking would work between retail and residential, because that's really where you can get certain savings with parking. Another element of parking savings is when you're located close to a transit line. That's something that, and really with a lot of development in the area, both commercial and residential, parking drives a lot of the cost. Once you run out of space for surface parking, your costs will increase pretty dramatically by, an order of magnitude in terms of accommodating new parking on accommodating that additional parking in an area. So,
Would the city need to adjust code to allow for shared use parking, or does the current building code allow it?
I think that it currently allows it.
Yes, we actually do have some cross allowance for parking, and sometimes it works really successfully, sometimes it's not so successful. It's kind of interesting you identify that, because in a discussion we had with the North Creek Owners Association, it's one of the business parks down south here, they were having some issues with their TD at transport demand management. They were actually doing more flex hours, and they're running into a conflict with some of the parks parking. We have some of those parks that are right next to those buildings, and what they were identifying to us is that we don't have the more traditional 8 to 5 or 9 to 6 kind of jobs. We have people that are there virtually 24 hours a day. Juno Therapeutics is a very prime example. They have 12-hour shifts, and they have people coming in basically on that rotation, and so they really have very little extra quote-unquote parking available. So it's kind of there's a little bit of a change in dynamics in how some of these companies operate, as well as some of the extra parking they have. So, but I think that transit is going to be a really important focus for when we talk about the parking ratios.
Good, thanks.
With that transit question, so the Swift Green Line, it's been online for a while now, not too long, but I'm wondering how long we can expect before we have a good idea how the market is responding to Swift Green Line. I know Swift Blue Line through Snohomish County is a little bit more historic, and we might be able to process some numbers based off of that, but what are your expectations for market conditions in the future based upon the Green Line and how young it is?
So I think that the expectation is that transportation accessibility will improve, that the connections that it makes to job centers is such that it's seen as being an amenity for new residential growth. So because of that, there are a number of other factors that can also impact what the market in the area will look like, ranging from how much residential growth is allowed to what the market looks like in 3 or 4 years for new residential growth. So it's a bit of a crystal ball kind of prediction, but the expectation though is that the price of property will increase, the feasibility of these areas will be viewed as being very feasible and very competitive for new residential growth, and that's something that's going to need to be considered in the policies for the area. So,
I see. I've looked into a little bit of responding data from Swift Green Line in terms of Everett and Mill Creek, but once it makes a connection to downtown Bothell and the whole transit hub starts coming online, that's going to change a whole lot in terms of I guess the economics of the Green Line in general. And so I'm wondering how much weight we're putting on current data from Swift Green Line when realistically current data, it's still young, one, it's not even all the way complete, two, and so my question is more, how much are we depending on the data that we're gathering right now from Swift Green Line?
I mean, you are right in that we are kind of looking at historic data, and there is a pretty considerable change from expanding transit, and that's going to increase. I mean, you know, there are certain factors involved with the 405 BRT, but as transportation accessibility improves, this area will be seen as being more attractive. What we were looking to do was to, you know, kind of evaluate how it is currently, to determine in the short term what would we be able to expect for the area. In the longer term, it's a bit more hand waving, but what we wanted to do was to acknowledge that there may be room for greater employment growth, that the calculations of feasibility for that may change, especially if it's viewed as being an employment TOD, for example. So we can't necessarily predict out, you know, over 10 years what that may look like, but we wanted to, you know, based on the knowledge that we have about how other areas have performed, we wanted to make sure that there was those allowances that were there. So that's a really long way of saying, you know, in 10 or 15 years, we're not quite sure about how everything's going to shake out, but we do know that this is going to become a more attractive area for all types of development.
Okay,
So
that's a fair answer.
And if I may, one of our endeavors is that we've been gathering a technical advisory group for transportation, and members of community transit have been in attendance. I am more than comfortable reaching out to them and saying, hey, what are your Swift Green Line number projections and how has that been going along? I do know that we didn't get the numbers, but they were very positive on what they have seen so far in that and the growth of that Green Line. We'll get you numbers.
yeah.
For what it's worth, I was at the State of the City luncheon today, and one of the speakers was the CEO of Community Transit, and he mentioned the Green Line. And if I'm remembering the numbers correctly, I think he said their boardings are about 2,000 per day on that line, and it's now the second busiest line that they have. So obviously, it's becoming more popular, and we anticipate that it will continue in that trend, as you said, especially when it gets to downtown.
Okay. Well, thank you for that.
Your turn? Yeah, okay, I'll do it. Thanks for doing that. Sorry, I can't believe it. It's okay, no big deal. I close my eyes, I see it.
All right, so you're just getting some papers, just so you can follow along. We're mostly tonight trying to settle this preferred alternative middle ground land use direction. The transportation will follow, and we'll do more analysis, but ideally tonight we'd have a good sense of what's really making sense to you all, what's gelling, what lingering questions are there, and how do we want to bring this forward the next time. So, a little bit of a recap of what these different land use types are. You can follow on the map and you can follow on your chart here. But the idea behind this middle ground preferred alternative, this is a pre-preferred alternative, we're not quite there yet, but our draft middle ground, mixing up that business plus and live work action alternatives, but using the growth numbers of that mitigated live work alternative and the regional growth center boundary of the mitigated one. So the numbers have stayed about the same to the mitigated live work, but we've been mixing and matching with the land uses with your help from the last time we were here. So if you start in kind of the philosophical center, it's a little bit south, not the geographic center, but the center where you have the green line meeting the I-405 line. This is where we see the most energy being spent, the most intensities, but it's a little bit tricky because it's encumbered by this big I-405, massive amount of space, air quality issues, noise. So we start with that dark pink, high intensity land use so that people can have direct access right to both of those lines, but recognizing that you might not want to have residential right there. And this has traditionally been a jobs area, so letting that be kind of a mix where market can decide we might do some jiggering to try to make sure office comes in closer to I-405, trying to make sure that's encouraged, but residential may come in further out to make more of a holistic neighborhood. Yeah, so the park and ride is right there, and we would hope that at some point redevelops as a transit-oriented development with a wonderful pedestrian path through to 17th and a main street heading north. These yellow main streets would mean that's somewhere where we would envision retail or some kind of active ground floor being required in those spaces, so that you have that nice eyes on the street and active paths out from this center. As you go further out, things get less dense, just knowing that you're further away and the parking gets harder to accommodate. You have to do more parking, so it's more costly, so you see lower densities. Similarly, up here, we have a little bit of an area where there's higher densities based on that green line stop. But really noting that this is the area that we see the immediate focus. So city investment in this area, the green stars are gathering spaces, just conceptual locations. So investing in this area first and seeing what we can get there to connect people to the existing business park and to the existing neighborhoods out here. And then letting this happen a little more naturally over time and seeing what happens there. So the purple is, so just recapping a little bit, the pink is a mixed use.
Can I pause just real quick? Just a quick question, sorry. There's not public right-of-way crossing 405 there. Is there a plan for that, or would acquisition be required?
Yeah, so the express toll lane project brings 17th kind of up to there, and the BRT stop is a flyover stop.
Yeah.
So it would actually connect to the BRT, and then the pedestrian path would come back over.
But where would it land on the south side of 405, like the southwest side?
We have a rendering, a washed out rendering of that. Before that is developed, though, unfortunately, it still is over here.
Right.
Yeah. So that is one thing that we've talked about, is making sure that pedestrian connection to the BRT stop is really lovely and connecting you into that development there.
Yeah, and from a more longer-term vision, WashDOT actually does have a plan to have that BRT stop be able to connect to the south to 228th Street. That's a much longer-term kind of a concept. We want to make sure our planning addresses that and takes advantage of that, because, things could happen much quicker than we anticipate, and that's kind of what we're thinking could occur here as well. So. But there is that potential to have that connection back and forth, particularly pedestrian-wise.
Okay, thank you. Does WashDOT own that building where Zeke's Pizza is? I know they used to have an office there.
They do not.
They don't own that property?
They do not own the property,
Okay.
no. They own of course, they own the park and ride. But
Right,
they
on
don't
the other
own
side, yeah.
Yeah, but they don't own that southern property.
Okay, thank you. Sorry to derail your
That's good.
presentation.
No worries at all. So the pinks are generally office or residential, whichever you choose. And then the oranges are just residential. And then the purples are just employment. More intense, less intense. So going through that in a lot more detail. Tell me to hurry up if this gets boring. This is just to give a little visual of what these kinds of densities look like. So the dark orange we put up in the Thrasher's Corner area. And the reason why we did these oranges and not calling them residential and office mixed use, and they're just residential mixed use, was so that we could guarantee we are addressing that growth target need for residential, getting that 15% mix of residential and that 4,500 residents. So no matter what, we get them, even if for some reason, some crazy market condition flip-flops, and all of a sudden residential is less viable, we still would get it in these areas. So that's why we have that as a single use in terms of the upper floors. The ground floors could still, of course, be commercial. So then moving to the lighter orange, this is moving away from the transit centers and connecting more into, at least for this southern one, into existing neighborhoods. This one connecting the Thrasher's Corner into the business park. These are the types of densities we would see. What's interesting when we look at these densities is you can't really tell where the parking is and how much there is. So when you look at the street side, it's hard to tell what exactly what's back there. So our apologies. Maybe another time we will try to do some kind of aerial view where you can see how much of the site is taken up by parking. Because interestingly, they often end up looking similar. Another note is that we've looked at minimum densities, but then saying that there's a target density. And this relates to kind of what you all were talking about earlier, the long-term vision, and that as the city invests in the area, as the market changes, as the green line becomes more viable, as the I-405 line is there, as the holistic neighborhood becomes more of a place that people really can envision, these target densities would be what you start to see. So that's why I'm showing two densities, a much lower one and a much higher one for a lot of these. So then the low density one, I will note that this spot is the one and only spot where we put this. And unfortunately, it's a singular patch, but it is the way it is. We have done our best to conceptually connect it, and we do think that there will be a nice pedestrian path along 220th. We may talk about this being a high visibility corner and requiring retail along that corner, something to make it feel like it is connecting in other ways to the other areas, to the other residential areas and into the business park.
And just to complete it, this is where there is an existing townhome project that is under construction right now.
So yes, and some of these notes are in the chart. So if you're looking along and trying to understand more of the rationale, please feel free to skim through that as well. So then we come back to this dark pink area. So it's around the TOD areas. And here you could have office or residential. So the images that I'm showing this time around are office images, but the residential that you just saw in the last set of slides would work for this as well. So then the medium, the office residential medium, moving outwards from the TOD. And I'll note that at your suggestion, we've expanded the potential area for residential east of North Creek. We think that does kind of connect this whole area, even around that single family area, as one sort of neighborhood. So again, it's an office or residential. The market right now would likely put in residential today. We could see what happens later. While I'm on this slide, I'll mention too what Andrew was talking about earlier, that in a way in our region, we could say that residential uses are crowding out commercial uses. There's a sort of displacement feeling that's happening, that our general commercial and industrial lands are slowly being pushed further and further afield. So when we start discussing this, let's think about, do all of these residential areas make sense? The incubator spaces that we see here now, as Andrew has, he has the realistic lens on that, that eventually they're gonna go. So whatever use comes in here, just make sure that it works in the long term for what you want. Another point is that Andrew made is that when residences come in, they typically don't go away. So just we'll be thinking about what that commercial and residential mix is. So then in the low area, this is around North Creek, existing residential, and then there's a proposal for a residential development here. So it's our other low office residential area. It likely will be residential. And then the employment medium are these dark purple areas. And would accommodate taller office buildings than what is currently there now. I think taller than most of them. And then the low would be similar to what is there now. Knowing that the height limits that are already on the ground there now are pretty high. But the big deal about the purple areas is that we would not allow residential uses, whereas right now residential is allowed. And that is for what we were talking about earlier, to try to prevent or to protect the commercial uses that are there and prevent displacement from residential. Because as we have seen, wherever the CCNRs are lifted, there tends to be these residential developments proposed. So I want to go through a little bit of a transportation update as well. But are there any questions on that land use mix stuff? And we can get into a deeper discussion too, just on the preferred alternative in a bit. Yeah.
Couple quick questions. Thanks for the presentation. So the low residential area that's sort of in an island is it's designated that way to accommodate what's currently going in place.
Yeah.
Do you see any other areas of potential developments that are either in the pipeline, and maybe Bruce, you can answer that, or planned that would kind of turn this into a checkerboard where we're going to have other areas that are kind of one-off residentials, or do you think this is the lone outlier?
Yeah, right now, this is the only outlier that we have identified so far. Now, the others that are in the pipeline, of course, one was on the piece of property that Sound Transit looking at for a bus facility. And the other, of course, is going through, but it is at a density of about not quite 40 some odd per acre. It's kind of an apartment flat. So it's not too bad from the standpoint of a number. So it's not going to be that low concept, that at least what we project as they've gone through the development proposal in the pipeline.
Okay, perfect. And I think we've had a little bit of a mind shift. When we initially started looking at Canyon Park, we were looking at meeting some of the 2040 goals as far as where could we maximize residential in this area. And it's nice to see that you guys are focusing on keeping, employment centers intact, because it's really a critical element to Bothell. So we need to have both, and I think the way that you guys have it lined out initially achieves that. So that was good to hear.
How much is development here constrained by stormwater management and floodplain management? Particularly along that southern area with North Creek. It floods pretty heavily. And you can see with more impervious areas, there being some issues. And then you look downstream on North Creek, Fitzgerald gets closed every big storm because of the amount of water being pushed through.
Yeah, well, there's two things that we've actually had conversation with our surface water folks about. One, of course, is that any redevelopment is going to have to meet the new manual, and that's going to be a real key function. Now, we've also had discussions with the engineering group that works with the developing communities, and those new manual provisions are going to be really tough to meet, because we're going to talk about retention, maybe even within a building itself. So we're going to have some pretty serious discussions about which way we go. There may even be a possibility of doing something like allowing North Creek to be identified as a receiving body, very much like the Seminole River is. That's a long, far out discussion we'd have to have with ecology and others. We're not so sure that's feasible, to be frank, but we'll have that discussion and we'll talk about it. But yeah, you're right. Surface water management is going to be really important as they go through the redevelopment stage.
Well, what does that mean, a receiving body?
Basically, a receiving body means you don't do the detention. You do a quality, and you try and get the water out as fast as possible in advance of the rest of the area coming into that water body. So the concept would be, okay, feed it to the river real quickly so it gets out before the big rush, if you would, of the rest of the sub-basin comes in.
That is a salmon spawning area.
It is.
So washing
It
those
makes
gravel.
it makes
Yeah,
it a
washing those
lot.
gravel beds is not a,
Yeah, it makes it a lot tougher. Although I will say that right now is that with the flashiness of that North Creek now, we know that we've got that issue going on currently. And one of the things I know that our draft environmental impact statement did, and that was some of the work that Pertite did, was they said, okay, we need to have a conversation about some kind of a regional facility. And one of the comment letters we received from Ecology on that was, hey, look, you guys don't forget some type of a regional facility that we can kind of start talking about as far as doing something that's much more holistic for surface water, because it's a real issue in this area.
I will point out, just in the terms of development feasibility, though, the whole region has to deal with this new stormwater manual. It's not just Canyon Park. The flooding issues and the water level may be a little higher here, but everybody's having to meet those requirements.
Right. And something else that's happening right now is that FEMA, Federal Emergency Management Agency, has been doing a new study on what the new floodplain area mapping is. Exactly, yeah. And of course, that study's been going on for several years, but they are working on that study to identify what the actual new flood flow rate is. And we're going to get really boring here with some technical stuff. But basically, the idea is that we know that the flood rate has increased dramatically over the years in this on this creek.
Quick follow-on question. This is infill development for the most part, right? So it's fairly impervious as it is. So we're not going to add a ton of impervious surface, or is that incorrect?
Well, we're not going to add a ton of impervious surface. We may, but no matter what happens with the redevelopment proposal, they have to comply with the new manual.
Understood.
Yeah,
I'm just,
so
I'm
in-
just
in
thinking a
fact, we will-
no-build alternative could get really bad too.
We would likely improve conditions.
Okay,
New
that's what I was
development would be better than what's on the ground.
It'd have a better surface water function, because right now this is all 1980s, early 1990s development, which has got very minimal detention currently.
Parking lots, flat roofs, and lawns, right?
Yeah.
Okay, thanks.
Yeah. Lots of surface drainage. So yeah, infiltration, green stormwater infrastructure, detention, all that stuff would be part of new development. So ready for a little bit on transportation? I'm gonna fuel channel my inner Carmen here, if you all remember her from last time. So you all asked us to look a little bit more at pedestrian and bicycles and how they're getting around. So we tried to highlight what are people really going to and getting from, and what already exists and where can we connect better. So the big deal, again, is this center here in the 405 line and the Swift Green line, that park and ride and TOD area here. So connecting out from there, we show these dark pink Main Street type things, and extending it a little bit along 220th, and not necessarily that it would be a super active, like all active retail along there, but that it would be a really nice pedestrian environment connecting you out into the business park. North Creek Trail is the other thing that we really want to highlight, is here already, and a great north-south route. And a lot of people are using it as an amenity, even if they're not working in the area. So making sure that wherever you are, you can get to the North Creek Trail, and you can use that to get down to the TOD and up to Thrasher's Corner as well. So there are a lot of little things that with redevelopment can happen, and then there are a lot of holes. So the little things are, with redevelopment, these through block connections could be required. So you could say every 300 feet when you redevelop, and this could take forever for it to happen. But when you redevelop, you can get these through block connections. They can end up being more like alleys. They could serve just pedestrians. They could be streets that serve cars. But getting that smaller grid that makes it a lot easier for people to walk directly from their workplace to where they're taking transit. The holes are more like these places where there are just sidewalks missing, or there's something about that environment that we noted could really use an improvement. 9th Ave, the entire thing could use trail and sidewalks, continuous sidewalks along the entire thing, and that's particularly important since we're talking about 214th connecting there and seeing a lot more cars on that street. And then you all had mentioned that there are some holes in sidewalks down in these areas as well. Intersection crossings, there are crosswalks, but just improving them or adding crosswalks in more places. Looking at signal timing to make sure people have enough time to cross the street, those kinds of improvements. And as you all have pointed out, making sure that whatever that flyover stop is, making sure it really connects well down into this area. This is that retail corner that could be, that helps that townhouse development maybe feel like they're part of a little neighborhood that connects into all these jobs. Interestingly, there are a lot of trails that do exist. So connecting up the hill, especially if you do end up living here and your kid goes to the school up here, making sure you don't have to drive all the way around to get around, that you could just walk or bike up the hill. So this is one of those holes that's like, oh, that would just kind of make sense. If you've got a lot of people living here, get them up there. And this is a utility corridor, so the space is already there. It would just be a trail under electrical lines, I believe. We will continue looking at this, so if you have any other suggestions, let us know. Thank you, Carol, for reminding me there's an important one over here that this property owner would like to see. So something that connects you right into that main street. So one of the things that the Interagency Transportation Advisory Committee asked our team to look at was a bat lane options for Bothell Everett Highway. And so this would mean the exterior 2 lanes being mostly for transit, so buses would be on it, and then anybody turning right into the businesses along the sides. So that's what the bat lane idea is. So Fair and Pierce took a look at this, and Bothell Everett Highway will be, when the comp plan projects are put forth, there will be 7 lanes. So it would just be taking the exterior lane. Yeah, it's almost 7. It's 7 lanes in most places, sometimes even wider. So it's just converting those exterior lanes to these bat lanes. So that's the idea of what the bat lane is. And we were asked to look at it with this lens, especially that we can't build our way out of congestion. We've got to figure out a better way. We can't just, we actually considered saying, okay, what if we do 9 lanes? But we were told, no, don't worry about that one, not building our way out. So we looked at how long it would take for people to get through the corridor and what those delays would be with and without the bat lanes. So the results are here with the mitigated live work, 2043. These are the delays you would see. So we did it by person and by transit, and then overall by vehicle. This chart on this slide shows just one sample intersection. So what you see is that transit riders get like a 2-minute saving. So they get a great deal here. But when you look at just people when you look at the automobiles, they actually lose time. And then it pretty much is kind of a loss for everybody except for the transit riders alone. Even when you do average by person, it's an increased delay on average because there's so many people in cars and the cars are so much slower when the bat lanes are there. Does that make sense? So we came back to the Interagency Transportation Advisory Committee just this last week.
Sorry, on that last slide, you said,
Yeah.
does it make sense? And I just had one question. Is this based on current transit service? So the 470 transit persons is based on current level of service, or?
That's a great question for Carmen. I'm not I know that it's the Swift Green Line, but I don't know if it's like the 2043 super tons more buses.
So it's just Green Line, doesn't include the other CT buses on that?
We'd have to ask Carmen.
Is it
We can bring that back to
Carmen
you.
Kwan?
Yeah.
I'll ask her.
We'll get that clarified.
Okay,
Good question.
thanks.
Yeah. So the direction from the committee was we really need to make transit more desirable. So this kind of situation where transit's just flying through and everybody else is stuck waiting was what they were basically suggesting to us. Just making it as desirable as possible for people to ride transit. And they asked us to look at a couple more options. So what if you moved those buses to a center lane that is reversible? Or what if that lane, a bat lane traditionally just is right in, right out for the people going into businesses and the buses, but what if it's also HOV? So you start allowing a few more cars into that lane. Does that help everybody get through a little more easily? So those are some things that we will be looking at now. And then another thing that I'll talk about in a few slides is this parallel transit corridor that they also asked us to look at. So they're trying to help us figure out ways for transit to work better and the whole system to work better. So this idea of a reversible lane in the center is something that they would like us to look at. It gets very complex very quickly, as you can imagine. You either have to have a bus that has doors on both sides. Well, the easiest thing is if the bus has doors on both sides. Otherwise, you have to have islands on both sides, or a lane that goes one way and the other way, and then that widens the street out. So again, it gets very complex very quickly. It's also intuitively kind of challenging. If you're riding a bus, say in the morning, you'd have to catch it here. But if you're going that same direction in the evening, you'd have to catch it here. So it's an interesting thing. At a very high level, Fair and Piers will look at whether or not it's a feasible concept for this corridor.
Excuse me. And are you projecting that distinct a temporal difference, morning in one direction, evening in the other? Is it that strong in this corridor?
Yes, that's our understanding.
Even going forward, huh?
You mean, yeah, the 2043 projections, I believe, still show that.
Yeah, there's still a very strong AM and PM peak hour component, and it's very marked. Yeah, interesting, huh?
Yeah.
It would be interesting to see an analysis on bat lanes in each direction and reversible single occupant vehicle or car lanes. If you're studying all of the other ones, I mean, if there really is a higher demand for southbound traffic in the morning and northbound traffic in the afternoon, seems like a reversible lane configuration would not be difficult.
Yeah. General purpose reversible center lane. Yeah.
Yeah, I think I know some of the ITAC folks actually were talking about that as an option, and I think we wrote it down as, well, maybe that's just something, but we'll make sure Carmen knows to check that one as well. Thank you.
Yeah.
Yeah.
This parallel transit route idea is the idea that the current routing goes south on Bothell Everett Highway and then turns onto 220th and then down to the Park and Ride. And then I believe it comes up this way and then turns right onto Bothell Everett Highway. So it's kind of already happening just right here. But the ITAC was thinking that since Bothell Everett Highway is so jammed up, what if you got the buses off earlier, so up here at Maltby, and then bring them down on this street extension that we're talking about, not built, we don't know what time frame that would happen in, but down that line and then bringing them down into the business park and then down to the Park and Ride. So that's one idea. More feasible options in case this road doesn't happen is right here by Fred Meyer or 214th are other ways that you could get off of Bothell Everett Highway sooner. So that is an option. One of the interesting pieces about it is then you could talk about adding a stop that's more central to the business park. So one of the things we've been challenged with this whole project is, dealing with knowing that your transit amenity is here, and so you want all your people as close to here as possible to be within that 5-minute walk. So it's kind of interesting that maybe one line could serve in here, and what does that mean then for our land use mix? So that's where our middle ground alternative, when we talk about it later tonight, let's come back to that. Some things that we need to look at is this actually any faster than Bothell Everett Highway? So we have to actually check that. We need to really understand that. And then again, those land use implications. But we think it's kind of exciting because it could better serve the business park. So Andrew talked a little bit about this, just that we are looking at both the comprehensive plan projects and these mitigation potential projects that are the blue ones. So again, just to recap, that's some intersection improvements and the new street connections, which is this little connection connecting the existing part of 214th that really is serving just a few residents up here and then some townhomes here and then connecting it out to 9th, and this connection up here and then widening to 28th. Those are the three kind of bigger items.
And that's not showing the 219th.
Oh, yeah, I'm sorry.
What's not shown?
It's the 219th's not showing up.
Oh, yes. Yeah. So there's a gate that connects, that's between 219th. Yeah, this must be an older map. And Phillips. And so opening that up so that the employees here could go out there. And that's a few hundred trips.
Good catch.
Yeah. Thank you. Yeah, there it is. There we go.
I have a concern just adding volume into a school zone right there. That
Yep.
frankly, I can't see, I mean, I see people drive every day and it still boggles me that people have licenses, but putting more volume into a school zone, I just don't think it's a good idea, period. Have you guys thought about that?
Yes, we have
And I
thought.
know 9th and still there are no sidewalks along, I mean, there's a park there, there's a school. Adding more volume of cars, I just don't think makes a hell of a lot of sense.
Yeah, it's definitely a serious consideration. And one of the things that we'll talk about too is the phasing of these projects and whether or not we want to stipulate something like this in the planned action that improvements to 9th Ave have to happen first before you can connect to it, something like that. So that there are really safe crossings, really safe buffered sidewalks, buffered trail, something like that, so that even if there's more traffic on the road, it's a safer environment. One thing I want to point out that more traffic is not always a bad thing. It can actually slow down drivers and be a good thing for just activity along a street. So, yeah.
It's not speed, it's distracted driving that is the issue nowadays, I think.
And I have heard that speed also is an issue on 9th. And so having more drivers does tend to slow down the driving.
Interestingly enough, 9th Avenue actually is designated as a collector arterial in the city's comprehensive plan. So it is one of those roadways that is intended to accommodate quite a bit of roadway traffic anyway. But your point is very taken. It's a school, and it's really tough to add more traffic to a school area.
And do I recall correctly that the right-of-way is there for widening 9th? It's not developed, but I think that the right-of-way, at least in some portions, is established.
I know that in some locations where there's been some development in the last 5 or 6 years, I know that there's been additional right-of-way dedicated. I can find out. I know for sure it's at least 60 feet wide. And it might be, and it's certainly wider in other locations. We can find out that for you.
Yeah, when we did our 9th Ave community meeting, that was more fresh on my mind and I could have answered then. But I believe that there is always room for an arterial and what changes in some portions it pinches down and you might not get as wide of like a buffered landscape strip or something like that. So the big point that I want to make on this slide is that 9th Ave increases from 1,100 trips a day from today's existing conditions, or 2019 actually, to 2,200 trips a day when you connect 214th out to it. So we did have a community meeting with the 9th Ave residents, and there were a lot of ideas that came out of that and a lot of potential improvements to 9th Ave that would help the whole street function better and more safely. So looking at what intersection options would make sense wherever 214th comes in and up at Maltby Road. And whether or not they're roundabouts or signals, and looking at the school zone, setting reduced speed limits and enforcing them, putting cameras, trails and buffering, an amazing thing that street trees can do is actually slow down traffic. When you're driving next to something vertical, you naturally slow down. So just having something right next to you on the street can really help. So there were a lot of ideas and a lot of suggestions. We're still looking at what's rising to the top out of all of that. But we know that 9th Ave would need improvements to help this feel like it's a viable option to connect 214th out to it. Signal timing, sorry, that was another thing on there. And that was particularly important going down to the southern end. There's something about these signals and configuration that this is not functioning very well. So looking at that and signal timing.
Excuse me, on the signal timing front, so I'm always curious as to, when I'm sitting, I'll be somewhere late at night or whatever, and just sitting there it's like I'm busier. So when it comes to signal timing, generally, is it the county, the city, the state, to coordinate like places where there's obviously issues one way or the other, they're too fast or they're too slow?
Yeah, if it's a state highway, then WashDOT does need to be involved. For other ones,
Yeah, for the most part, the city of Bothell, on this right-of-ways that it has control over, does its own signal timing. And in fact, actually, what we do is we contract with Snohomish County Signal Group to do some of those timing studies and setting those timing designations for us.
And so how does the city find out from citizens or whatever when it's not working, whoever we're contracting with or whatever, to say, if there's spots that, doesn't seem like in 15 years they haven't changed and yet the traffic's changed in 10. So is the city relying on the person we're contracting to give us data on that and then change the signal timing accordingly?
And actually, if you go to one of our transportation engineers' office, he's got all these cameras and all these big monitors where he actually functions and watches how some of these signals are functioning. And they actually do get a lot of contacts from people and saying, hey, this signal just seems to do this or whatever it happens to be, and not enough time for a pedestrian to cross it. And they actually do go out there and they do some of those timing aspects for it. One of the things they have to be careful about is if you change one signal, it kind of affect what else you're doing throughout the corridor. So that's one of the things that's really complex. But they actually do look at those things pretty significantly.
Okay, thanks, Bruce.
So how dynamic is the signal timing? Traffic patterns are different at different times of day. Does the timing adjust during different times of day, or is it based on an average or a worst case, or?
I'm
Is the answer
going
to
to
that
ask
yes?
that question for the people who actually do it more often. I do know that they spend a lot of time trying to get those things coordinated, particularly when you're on our major corridors, because they want people to be able to get from this point to that point in a rapid as possible and as safe as possible provision. But I can ask that question of our transportation folks.
Thanks.
all right. So now deep into the discussion. So thinking about that middle ground alternative, what are you all thinking? Is it capturing the vision for Canyon Park? Is it hitting that right mix? Is there any way we could simplify it?
Quick question. So the properties surrounding the 405 interchange with Bothell Highway, how do you propose we encourage or regulate so that office development goes in, or high residential, as opposed to mixed use or some other development?
Yeah, that's a great question. One thing is that we could set a buffer for air quality, and there's more and more guidance coming out on that, and it's something like 500 feet is a minimum that you should have from a heavily trafficked road. So we could say 500 feet or more, no residential allowed. And naturally then, if somebody wants that area, they would have to put an office. So that's one idea. We can try to think of other creative ways and look at other mechanisms to try to encourage office and make office more feasible than residential. Is that something that's desirable?
Well, I think so. I mean, I think we're all kind of in favor of letting the market decide to a great extent, but Even when we look at downtown, there was early renderings that had office and residential intertwined, and realistically, the market has demanded residential. So
Yeah.
I think, to your point earlier, we want to try to keep an element of office within, a TOD center like 405.
So an easier way would be just to have a zone that's for office. So how important is it to let the market decide, or to just outright say, this should be commercial and we'll wait as long as we need to for it to come in? That's the thing, it'll be a waiting game.
I mean, I'd like to get everyone else's opinion, but it seems like our most successful developments are back to our biotech and some of the other less traditional office spaces. So I don't know that forcing office on an area that really hasn't traditionally sought it out is necessarily going to be the best move, but I would like to encourage it. I just trying to balance that out.
Some of these areas, I know when to avoid, period. That's just the way it is. Now, I don't know if I'd want to be on a Saturday or Sunday and have the same issues that I'd be there in the morning or afternoon during the week. So I'm real skeptical of having residential in this area, because that's going to be now an issue on the weekends for Bothell residents. What are we doing? It's better for the city. What's better for people that live here? I really don't think putting heavier residential in this area is a good idea.
And so the alternative would be changing the growth targets for the area and figuring out how to do that, if that's even a viable option, or then putting more jobs in the area rather than residents. So were you leaning in one of those two ways?
I'd rather have more jobs than residents personally, but that's just me.
And so one of the benefits of having the mix of uses is that then you have both directions of traffic. So having the residents and the jobs both, if the whole thing was jobs, then you really would have, those peak hours would be even stronger on the Monday to Friday.
I do think, given the air quality and the noise, quite frankly, having that setback, which would then in effect strongly encourage the office use close into the freeway, is a way to go.
Can you talk a little bit more about how that buffer would work? Would that be a citywide or a regional buffer? Because I see residential going up around, within 500 feet of major transportation corridors all over the region, and I just wonder
We've only thought about it in terms of this sub area.
Yeah, and it would only apply in this location unless we make other changes to the comp plan, but right now it would only apply within the Canyon Park area.
It just seems wild to me that we already have all of this white on this map for the highways and for the freeways, and then we're gonna add 500 feet on either side of that and say people can't live there because cars are so dirty. But then we're unwilling to put a bus lane on either side of Bothell Highway. It's just counterintuitive to me that we would create space where people can't live because it's so dirty, but not try to fix it by getting people on buses and out of their cars, even at the cost of a delay for drivers.
So you're pro the bat lane?
Yeah, I don't think I want to live next to a freeway. I'm
Yeah.
definitely pro the bat lane, but
Yeah.
I think that we need to be. Yeah, I mean, I don't want to get off topic too much.
Yeah.
But I support the office use around here. I think with the Swift line, particularly when it connects to the 522 BRT, that's eventually going to come downtown, and the 405 BRT, it seems ripe for office development.
Okay.
And workers really want to be able to get to work fast and leave work fast. And people that are living in an area and doing more, hyper-local errands, other than you who doesn't want people in your way, don't mind a little bit longer delay going to the grocery store. But I'd rather a delay going to the grocery store in my neighborhood than a delay getting to the office. So all that to say, I support office around here. I don't know if we want to demand it, but if there's incentives, but I don't like the 500-foot thing. It just leaves a bad taste in my mouth. Other than that, I really like the way that we did the employment medium and low throughout to kind of support the existing uses. I think that, as you mentioned, or maybe Andrew mentioned, the current development of commercial and mixed use and residential is pushing some of the light industrial or industrial uses further out, and sometimes that means out of the region altogether. And we don't want that to happen. We need to support the industries, and especially the biotech that's helped prop this community up for a number of years. So it's good that we save that. I think I kind of spoke to what I wanted to say. So far, this looks good to me, other than the office.
I want to kind of respond with my with a response to what you just said. So initially, I think last study session we had on this subject, I brought up the fact that, in my opinion, it was an inequitable use of space to zone around the Bothell Everett Highway as exclusively residential, primarily because I was concerned with maybe engineering another Aurora Avenue or another area like in Seattle where we have all these urban villages around these very, super highways basically, where when we concentrate people next to cars, it's not a great idea. We don't want more traffic deaths. So I totally agree with what you were saying about, separating or either separating the use or not zoning residential near the highway. But at the same time, when you're talking about transitioning the mode of movement on this street, that's another. I didn't think about that initially, and so I would support. If we were to diet this road significantly, it will change the way that people and cars interact in this area altogether. And so I think that's a kind of a bigger shift, and that could change a whole lot more. But if we're willing to put in the effort to change this relationship between people and cars on the Bothell Everett Highway, that as it transects the region, then I'd be more supportive of that. But realistically, I don't know how much we'll be able to change the mode of transportation on Bothell Everett Highway because it is a state route. And so I'm with that realism, separating out the uses, and that's why I think in the initial live work alternative, there was significantly more residential mixed use in this area rather than office residential. So by having the office residential, I think that it'd be easier to get these good office spaces around the arterials, and if that needs to be with zoning and buffers, then I still support that. The other thing was about working these, or I guess saving and protecting existing uses in this sub area. Right now we're talking about rezoning with mixed use, and so what's been said before and what I've been operating on the assumption is that most of this stuff is going to be infill development over the next 30 years. It's not going to be necessarily overnight level everything that's not zoned as, or in this pink area, and put it into townhouses. It's not an overnight thing. And so I think we have to think in terms of staging here what our expectation is, and if it's truly going to be more incremental and infill changes, then I think that's going to govern a lot more of what we deem to save in this area, rather than like a mass exodus of businesses from Canyon Park just because it's been rezoned as potential office and residential. So I'm not certain I see the concern about saving the the businesses that are here, because it will still be zoned for those uses. And if they're successful uses right now, depending on their location, they can incrementally grow as well. So I guess in that way, maybe surprisingly more market decided opinion there. The last thing I wanted to point out was I just wanted to thank you for hearing my suggestion with the utilization of the waterway here. I think it's a great natural feature. And I really appreciate the that you heard my comments before. One thing that I might just change based on seeing this drawing is that there's a Main Street active ground floor area off of 17th projecting west or eastward, and there's a star there. It's very close to the trail, and there are some issues right now getting between, as you've heard, obviously, between the trail and the park and ride area right now. And so I think that focusing on a connection between the trail and that 17th Avenue area would be pretty important. It's not specifically called out on here, but that might have been more of the just design license with the colors on this map. So I just wanted to point that out, that connection as close to the park and ride as possible, if that's going to be a major bus transit hub. Getting people plugged into the trail quickly would be an easy way to extend the reach of bicycle and pedestrian infrastructure in the area.
Trails on the
That-
other side of the creek.
It
Yeah,
is on the
that,
other side.
that
but-
bridge is right there. That's what that yellow east-west Main Street
So
points
it
to,
does
is
go
the
into the bridge.
right
Okay,
there,
the
so
existing
okay.
bridge.
So it was planned.
It was
Okay.
intentional. One thing that I've noticed looking at this map, though, is that the east of that trail, the little dotted green line is pointed a little bit south. And now looking at it today, I'm like, oh, that actually should point more directly into the business park, or both ways.
And obviously, they're not set in stone now. We're not naming right-of-ways or anything, so it's not critical, but I just wanted to make sure that was, so it sounds like it is. That's great. I am gonna be looking forward to discussion on potential realignment of bus route through this area. I don't know how realistic that is, but if so, I'm wondering what the impacts would be at that intersection of 20th Avenue and 220th. That area seems a little underplanned on this map, but probably for good reason. So I want to hear what other people's thoughts are on that area. But yeah, that's my comments for now.
While we're on that, could I just ask that directly? If we discover that's a viable option and that is a parallel transit route and we get a stop there, how does that change how you think about the land use mix and intensity that we have marked on the map today?
I'm not sure I see specific changes to it. I would say, though, just as the comment was made, once housing goes in, it doesn't go away. The more development proceeds, the more difficult it is to upgrade transportation corridors. And a bus corridor like that, while it serves as amenity in some respects, the more development you get along it, the more resistance you'll see. So if that's a choice, I think it needs to be one that's executed as soon as possible. I mean, it would have been great if you could have gone through 23rd, but you got development there. So, the longer you wait and the more development gets in place, the more people get used to a lower level of traffic, and the harder it is to increase it.
Okay.
I would see a bus corridor as beneficial as it would be overall. People next to it, seeing buses roll by, would just reflexively react against it. So I'd say sooner, if that's the choice, start running buses through there right away.
There is a local line that runs along 220th. And actually up 20th.
It does, it goes up to 20th too.
Yeah, they're not very frequent though.
Yeah.
Yes.
So those are existing stops.
Yes.
Yeah.
To your question about the changes in land use, so I would support a alternate bus route for the north-south if it didn't have a big delay penalty for the detour. And that's not just for, riders getting off in there, but also when it continues south to downtown, we don't want to cost the people that are going all the way through a significant amount of time, but there could potentially be some savings with the delay on Bothell Highway. But we'd also want to look at what the level of service would be like as it gets more dense in there. Would the buses be stuck in traffic eventually? Because, we know we build roads and people start to use them and then there's delays. So is it going to be a dedicated bus lane or is it going to be stuck in traffic? As far as the land use changes, moving some residential a little bit further east would make sense if you did change that. Otherwise, it would be bisecting, low density office or commercial, and residential mixed use.
And would you pull more of the high intensity office residential mixed use or the medium to the east?
I think it really depends on the stop placement and the distance between the stops. I think residents don't necessarily want to walk a long way, more than, quarter, half mile to their home. So if you had some, very high density near the stops, and I know the Swift Liner is spaced more like light rail, closer to a mile, but maybe they'd have a couple stops in here, then we'd want to put the density around those. Office, I think people are willing to walk a little bit further because they get paid to. But
If you had theoretically two options to get in, if you're a bus, would it make sense to have like an express one where it goes all the way through? You have a dedicated bus lane and without as many stops, and then have the other one. I don't know if this is 4 lanes. I think 20th is 4 lanes if I remember right. Is it? Or is it?
I believe so.
There's a meet. I can't remember. I've been there in a while, but maybe it's not. But if you build this out to have 4 lanes, have one of those dedicated for a bus, that can go straight through. So if you want to make more stops, maybe you put it over here. But if you want one that goes from A to B without stops, then you don't necessarily need to make stops. Does that add value?
yeah, I would think, I think that there's a benefit to it. I just think that there needs to be further analysis. And I would just fear, as I said before, that it would be stuck in traffic and we'd have the same problem. And then Bothell Highway would be 7 lanes backed up. They'd lose their 130 seconds regardless of what we do with the buses on there.
I'd be curious because I know downtown Seattle had, was it 3rd Avenue for a couple of years? It was just buses only. I'd be curious to see.
Still is, yeah.
Is it still?
Yeah.
Is that going to be a permanent thing?
Yeah, I
don't
think it's
know.
right turn only at the block during peak hours.
How has that worked? I'd be curious to see if.
It
It's
moves more people
necessary. Mm-hmm.
than any other
Yeah.
north-south connection in
So maybe we
Seattle.
look at something like that actually City of Seattle did something right. You actually have an idea that's actually worked well. Can we mimic something that makes sense? So where you can move more people in a shorter amount of time, that's the goal, right?
I think there's probably a middle ground there. The bus mall downtown
Yeah.
is so frequent. I mean, it's like a bus at every stop, multiple buses per minute at every stop. And this would, I don't know what the headways are on
And
this.
you
but
hate,
it's
you hate
like
to
one
separate
line.
cars and
You wouldn't
buses,
need
but
it, yeah.
sometimes it doesn't make sense to separate as much as possible.
And I think that's one of the things we'd look at is how could we make sure that if that is a bus corridor, that we maximize the bus travel time, the ability for the bus to get through there as quickly as possible. I don't think we could do like a downtown Seattle on that particular portion because we still have to provide access to those properties. That's a different issue with the downtown bus street, but
I like the ability, I don't take transit, but I think there's a lot of value of having a dedicated transit lane of some sort, just for the ease of of commuting, people who do commute in and commute out, or
You can do transit priority
or
with the
or
signals
HOV,
also.
three people. If you got three people in your car, you can use a lane too. I don't know, but
Or you can do a bus-only lane during peak hours as well.
Yeah.
Yeah, there are different ways to approach that. But what I think I'm hearing, and correct me if I'm wrong, is that I think I'm hearing a consensus on the part of the commission that you're in favor of improved transit passage through here, whether it's bat lanes on the Bothell Everett Highway or the, what do we call it, the parallel transit corridor. Is that a fair statement? Okay. There's obviously a lot of details that we would have to look at in terms of what's going to work better and what the different considerations would be. Are we creating just another busy road, for example, if we make that a through street?
And that would be a citizen, the citizens would pay for the new road, correct? Or that would be another thing that maybe needs to be considered as well?
Yeah, I wouldn't assume that. I think that would depend on how we approach the improvements in that area.
Did these zones overall make sense? Did it make sense to have both an office residential mixed-use zone and a purely residential mixed-use zone?
yeah, I think it does. I think giving somebody the opportunity where you live and work and, you don't have to come from Bellevue or Everett or wherever, I think it makes a lot of sense.
And to Commissioner Hampton's comment earlier with regards to industrial use. So, and this may be more of a question or a concern, but I think it's the way the world's moving, which is, I think is good. But do you have residential, maybe historically you have these blocks that were purely offices. How does that work with regards to places that were historically just offices and they've liked how they, and then there's lighting issues, and then you have a mixed use, something move across the way, and the residents start complaining about the noise of 18-wheelers or, mill equipment or lighting or whatever. Like, is that an issue a lot, or is that something that just gets resolved over time? Because when you start moving people into an agricultural area, and then they start complaining about the smell of the cattle or whatever. It's like, so it's that kind of thing, but I guess in a different way.
Yeah, I think that knowing that it's already there makes it a lot easier. And one technique we've talked about in a different project is working with real estate agents in the area to just have that be part of just flagged for people looking to move into the area that, hey, this has traditionally been a commercial area. You will see trucks coming in and out. That's part of what you're moving into.
Yeah, and I can also see it being for a lot of, especially I think younger people, it can be really, you can do some really cool stuff with it. A lot of people like living in that type of vibe,
right.
so.
As far as the residential low density, it just seems so odd to me, and your explanation was really great. But given that we are 30, years from 2050, which is the goal here, to Commissioner Curd's point, this is going to slowly evolve, and I wonder if it would make more sense to zone that differently for potential future use. I mean, low density residential in an area like this is not even close to the highest and best use. So what is did we get feedback from the public as we developed this plan that they wouldn't want this to change, or are we just trying not to have a non-conforming use, or?
That was the main reason. I wonder if we at least change it to one of the office residential lows at a minimum.
If there were
Yeah.
other pockets in there,
Make them a live work.
it would make more sense, but it just seems like this
Right.
up house we're creating.
How bad is it for you all to have a non-conforming use?
It's not a huge thing.
What's that?
Yeah.
Yeah, right.
Yeah, actually, the city of Bothell's non-conforming use and structural regulations are pretty robust. I mean, they do allow people to continue that use in perpetuity, no issue at all, so, and they can maintain it and things of that nature. However, if they did decide to switch their unit, their little townhome, into some type of an office, then you might have an issue with their own internal CCNRs, but I mean, I guess that's a feasible thing that we could look into. The issue is that these are being townhomes, they are gonna be, I think they actually are acquired townhomes, I think is what the situation is, so it's gonna be pretty, again, residential is forever. And I think in this case, it's gonna be forever.
Oh, so it was already townhomes historically?
Well, it came in, the permit was actually townhomes, yes.
So what is it zoned right now?
RAC OPLI, basically a residential activity center, office preferred
Oh, but we
LI.
just didn't have a density requirement.
There you go.
Okay.
That's why we had that plan and code amendment that we worked on last year.
Speaking to Commissioner Hampton's last point, personal anecdote, I've been working on a project in Renton, which is a recent townhome development that they are redeveloping, and the townhomes were put in maybe 5 years ago. It's incredible to waste that many resources on a project, but I don't have any say over that. So one of the things is by putting a broad zoning classification on here, we might be surprised by what the market dictates in the future. And if this becomes an undesirable location to have townhome development, depending on whether they sell or not, I think I'd lean more towards making a congruent plan rather than planning for these weird little extra spots, because there are already a lot of uses that are a little incompatible now, like this single-family residential unit, which the financial update from earlier today suggested that there's some moderate degree of redevelopability of those properties. But I guess getting, I understand why that's not part of this update, but I think that we should probably just move it towards at least the low office residential, just so that it's more of a congruent part of the plan.
Also, we've heard Bruce say, the reason that this is like that is because we've heard a number of times over the years, and Bruce isn't going to be here in 10 years to answer that question, and nobody will ever know why this is. Exactly. So we might want to like future-proof this staff here. So.
Do you guys have more specific questions, or can we address one that we haven't really touched on up above? So the parking ratios reduced to improve development feasibility versus today's view of parking needs. I think that's a big one. I think you kind of see some underutilized land right now when you look at either side of 228th with the large retail space, serves a lot of people, but that parking lot is not probably the highest and best use. So I guess, are we looking at offering reduced parking for some sort of developer-led benefit to the city? Are we looking at TDRs? Is there anything that makes sense to, I guess, cut what our basic parking requirements will need to be when we're looking at specifically these very few TOD developments?
So just at a basic level, and I think you're getting more nuanced, but I'll start and then maybe Andrew can follow up. But at the basic level, where you're within a quarter mile of transit, we reduced the parking minimums. And so they're outlined on the chart. And so they are pretty close to downtowns. And so it makes it much more feasible to develop higher densities there. And ends up with a better urban form for walkability. As you move further out, those ratios raise up a little bit, so it gets harder and harder to develop with those higher densities.
I want to make sure we can get you on the recording.
Sure.
I mean, there's not that much more that I can add to that, except that, I mean, we're aware of the fact that this area is not going to become, like downtown Seattle tomorrow. That there is still going to be a need to support vehicle traffic and parking, but I think the key though is the parking is a major factor in development feasibility, especially for for residential and for commercial development. So any potential way that we can reduce the parking requirements to something that can be supported with the transit system, that's going to be a net positive for feasibility. So.
One of the things that sparked some of the questions that are up there are that we've heard a lot about what's happening today on the ground is that there are apartment complexes in unincorporated Snohomish County that don't have enough parking. And so people are parking in this sub area and to quite a great degree. So one of the things we wanted to ask about was, okay, knowing today's patterns, how much do we let that influence our thinking on these parking minimums? Or do we really work towards development feasibility and the form that you would like to see in the long-term future?
It's really hard to reuse structured parking as anything other than structured parking. And I don't want to see resources and environmental cost of dewatering North Creek to put in an underground parking garage just for it to be a vault of some kind in the future. Like, that's not worth it to me. So I'm more of the opinion that we should be looking towards the long-term form because we're putting the groundwork in now for what we want it to look like in the future, rather than planning for today's needs, which who knows how long the writing will be on the walls. So, yeah.
Question, clarification on the parking use by local apartments. Is that parking used, is it on private property, commercial developments, or is it on city right-of-way?
Commercial development's private property.
Okay.
Yeah.
So they have recourse if they want it?
Yes, and they're actually looking at enforcing that, yeah.
Okay. So I would support the quarter mile within the transit centers specifically, or especially the reduced parking requirement similar to downtown. And one of the thoughts that I had is one of the challenges we're having in downtown with the parking reductions is we're having spillover parking into the neighborhoods, and people in the neighborhoods are frustrated by that, and there is not a lot of enforcement capability by the city at this point in time. And I know that they're looking at that and they're evaluating different opportunities to address that, but it hasn't been addressed. And in this area, it seems like a less prime opportunity for people to illegally park in front of city right of way in front of people's houses. But I didn't think about parking on private property because I feel like people have recourse for that. So I think you'd even have a greater opportunity to reduce the parking in this area than you did in downtown, because you wouldn't have that spill over into the neighborhoods.
Interesting.
And then if people got in the building, they couldn't park, then it would be a market rate situation, right? Somebody built it and they didn't come. Whereas downtown, they built it, people came, and then they just park in the neighborhood. So the developer doesn't have any negative effects from that.
And one of the challenges that we're having in the downtown is the fact that parking is now decoupled from rent. So the parking is available, but people have the option. It used to be that when you rented the apartment, the parking was included with your rent. And now people have the option of not paying for the parking, but they still have a car. So that's what we're seeing in terms of the overflow onto city streets. They're also public streets. So unless we have a time limit on those streets, and as you said, the city doesn't have a parking enforcement program. And in most places, we don't have a time limit necessarily on those streets either. So we're balancing some different challenges there. And we don't control what the market does in terms of the parking, whether they decouple that from the rent or not. But that seems to be the practice right now, in new development at least. So the other thing that I'll mention is what we've been hearing in the downtown, actually from both situations, is that people are parking on city streets or in other parking garages in downtown that don't charge for parking. Or they're saying, well, they move downtown, they don't use a car because there is the transit available and they don't need a car. So I think we're in that situation here, we're going to be, where we're in that transition period where we don't necessarily have the level of transit yet, but it's coming. And we're creating the walkability, the proximity to transit, the proximity to jobs and services that fewer people will actually want to have cars or need cars. How do we bridge that period of transition? So I think what we're kind of using downtown as our model, knowing that it's not working perfectly, but it's moving in the direction that we see the trend going for the future.
Okay.
I don't know if that helps at all.
No,
but
it does.
That's kind of
I
the
think-
reality we're dealing with right now.
I think the thing that you said that surprised me the most is that buildings that have decoupled parking are not able to sell all of their parking. I wasn't aware of that. I understood that people would rent a place and maybe wouldn't be able to get parking in the building because the parking capacity didn't meet the demand for the people that lived in that building. So that's new for me. But I fully support decoupled parking. I think it should be required. I think that it gives people who take transit and don't have a car an incentive to do so. If you're paying for a parking spot in your rent, then you're already in the game, and you might as well, consider, having a car. Second, as far as not having parking enforcement, I think that's a great mistake. I think that the city of Bothell should have limited parking in front of businesses during business hours and give people that would be potential customers an opportunity to drive there and park there, even if it's free. And then at night, when the businesses are closed, people in the neighborhood can do whatever they want with those parking spots in public right of way. And then, yeah, those are my three comments. So.
And taking that out of the downtown context, we could look at applying those types of things in this area.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, and on that, I agree with Commissioner Hampton on that. Also, with having some kind of parking enforcement, because I think that's definitely a type of enforcement that could definitely pay for itself as well. It's not something that it's fun, I think it's paying for itself too, and it's serving a good cause.
So before we go too much further on parking, I just want to do a time check. We're about 8:15, and I don't know how much more discussion you're anticipating or direction that we need from the commission tonight, and whether if it's a little longer, then maybe we want to take a break at this point. Just asking if that's something the commission would like to do.
We have a few more transportation questions. I think we've covered most of this.
Well, the RGC boundary, did we talk about that sufficiently?
We can.
Well, clearly within this area, there are some sensitive areas. Centennial Park and the area I keep pointing to, of 228, which are flooded frequently. And I think making sure those are not included in here would have some value. Or, those are key, very likely areas for regional stormwater facilities as well.
Say that again, what you would,
Well, you have these two areas, Centennial Park, kind of in the
Yeah.
Northwest,
Yeah.
and then south on 228th,
yeah,
large areas that are not developable.
right.
And I would hope that those are not included in these areas when we're looking at the ratios. And when you look at regional stormwater facilities, one or both of those, that big chunk there.
So this map, the dark black dashed line is
Yes.
the proposed regional growth center boundary.
So I would support reducing it to that, certainly.
Yeah.
Rachel, could you go on the slide? Could you go back to the one that shows the old and the new? That might be
Oh,
easier
yeah.
to see than on this particular
Was that
map's a
in
little
your
hard to see.
presentation?
Is,
Oh,
think
I'm
it was
sorry.
in-
I can,
Okay.
let me,
I wonder if we have.
Well, that, you can kind of see it better, a little
this
better
one-
on that
This one
one.
has some of the old ones. So here's the old one. And the new one may not actually be on this map.
Should I
It's
switch?
close here. Actually over there.
Because I wouldn't want to increase development pressure on those areas when they're better used for other purposes.
Yeah.
And I've heard more than once that the owner of the southern property is interested in development, and I just don't think that's feasible.
I'm just going to switch it over for
And this is one of the things, I think we talked about this, one of the earlier discussions that we had with the commission about the changes. We've also had meetings with Puget Sound Regional Council about the changes that we're proposing. And what you're describing is a lot of the reasons that we decided to do that. We wanted to take out those areas that we know we're not going to develop, that are critical areas or they're parklands. And also that does then relieve some of the pressure on their other areas because they're not asking that area to make up the difference. So it actually helps our current number, as I recall. I think it brings us up above the 18 minimum that's currently required. It doesn't necessarily get us that much closer to the 45, but it really focuses on those areas where we know we can accommodate that in the future.
Well, I wanted to be sure to get my 2 cents in on that one, because I think that is significant.
And so this map does show then, you can see a little bit
Pull them
better,
up and-
yeah,
yeah.
the old and the new. The old is the dashed line, and then the new is the solid, darker line that goes up to Thrasher's Corner, 524, and then takes out some of those other areas.
Yeah. I think that is very much better approach.
Back to your question, does anyone feel like they need a break, or should we power through the last 15, 20, 30 minutes? Okay.
The one question on the RGC that's come up is the office park is generally at about 19 activity units per acre, if I remember right, today. And so we've talked about, should we carve any out and just say, okay, we know in the long term you're actually going to stay a similar use, and that 19 isn't getting us towards that 45. We've generally said, let's just keep it all in for the potential opportunity and for like a whole center. But that's one question we've thought about.
Yeah, I think it should be kept in because it's all kind of one similar use, and maybe it'll put an emphasis on trying to meet the 45 dwelling units an acre towards the areas that are not yet developed or closer to Bothell Highway.
I would support leaving it in as well.
What would it look like in the future if everything east of 23rd was removed from the RGC? Are there really any changes that we're doing besides these pedestrian connections and perhaps reduced parking minimums to what we're expecting this area to really look like in the future? And would that be a considerable
yeah.
increase in density units?
That would be a considerable land area, and we could reduce growth targets.
It would also put us well below what
You're right.
Puget Sound Regional Council is looking for in terms of the size of the regional growth centers. So I'd be hesitant to do it for that reason. But also, when we look at the future development of this area, even though there's not a lot of developable land per se, as it exists now, we are seeing growth in that area. We're seeing increased employment. Seattle Gen X in particular, which is probably the largest land user and employer in that particular part of the park, has expansion plans. And they've already added quite a few employees. So I think it would also probably, even though it might not have as great an impact as some of the other areas we're looking at, I think it still contributes to the overall in terms of increased employment in that area.
Okay, I see. It was just more of a thought exercise than a real suggestion. But
Suggested everything 23rd.
it just seems like a lot of the focus and emphasis, rightly so, should be near these transit hubs. But it just seems like maybe the way the map is drawn and the way that the colors are washed out towards the eastern end here, just makes it seem, I don't know. Where are we sitting at right now in terms of percentage of land with the proposed RGC being what is in line with Puget Sound Regional Council's desire?
If I recall correctly, the criterion is 640 acres.
That's the maximum.
That's the maximum?
Yeah,
Okay.
yeah, actually.
So we're below the maximum.
Yeah.
But I think they also want to make sure that it's not too small either.
Aren't there some that are really, isn't one in
That's what we were
Burien
just
that's
trying to
like
remember
Yeah,
what the
3
minimum
blocks?
I recall they have a
pretty
minimum,
small.
and it's I think it goes all the way down. It's either 200 or 400 acres,
And I was thinking
can't
400.
and I just
Yeah.
can't recall which one it is. But
And I think we changed it, and I don't remember what it is.
yeah, we did. So, however, it is important that we have this synergy. This park is kind of like a real entity in and of itself, and that is the area to the east is a very important contributor to that synergy of that life sciences biomedical device center.
I think it's a fair question to ask, and you know, we can give it a little bit more thought. We have looked at other areas that we might reduce this just to make it work a little bit better. We hadn't considered that particular area or, excuse me, that large of an area. But picking up on Bruce's point, I think I'd liken it to downtown, the downtown sub-area. You could argue that the campus is enough removed from the downtown that it probably shouldn't be included. But by including that, we do make it more a part of, and it's viewed more as a part of the downtown to help that synergy, to strengthen that synergy, basically.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. Yeah, thanks. I think my previous comment about potentially gerrymandering our way through, I recall that discussion. That I kind of have different thoughts now than what I did before. And just looking at the other RGCs in Snohomish and King counties, this one, it stands out. It's weird. It's not like any of the others. I mean, they, in the Vision 2040 or whichever one this most recent stuff came through for, they list like the most and the least, and it's always Canyon Park is in either the most or the least because it's just such an outlier. And so I think if we are moving the boundaries a little bit, like Commissioner Kiernan said, to remove the critical spaces to, I think that's warranted, and I don't have any qualm with that at all. So, yeah, that's my updated assessment.
And I would see keeping the areas east of 23rd and 26th within this because of the way traffic flows through there. I mean, it's all there are very few entrances and exits, and people that are working in those areas are going to be flowing through the rest of the area anyhow. So they're part of that community.
Transportation? Oh, yeah.
Oh, oops! I should have done it when I was up there.
Yeah, I forgot to. So we talked about the prioritizing transit, and I think we got a pretty clear answer that transit should be the priority, whether it's those bat lanes or whether it's a parallel corridor, that there's a lot of support for that. And then connections to the surrounding street system. So in particular, we're asking about 214th and 20th, and then that 219th little opening of the gate. Should we continue to consider those street extensions? Impacts to 214th are both ecological and to 9th Ave and 214th residents. Again, we were talking about a lot of improvements as well with that project. Impacts to 20th, both Fred Meyer and the strip mall property owner representative to the north were very supportive of that project. So the impacts there are really ecological. 219th, Phillips was pretty supportive
Very
of that as
supportive
well.
of it, yes.
I think looking long-term, having greater options for mobility is a good thing. And they have impacts. Building any roads have impacts. Not building these access points further congests Bothell Everett. And, we shouldn't deceive ourselves to think people aren't going to divert around onto 9th anyway. There's bypass traffic. I mean, heck, I don't do it myself, go around that way to avoid Bothell Everett. So I would support all three of those. They can and should be mitigated, but the consequences of not adding them, I think, are pretty negative regionally.
I guess my only question would be, and I think I'd be supportive of just this, who bears the cost of the extension of the roads? That'd be kind of who's paying for the development of those roads. Would there,
Well,
be any private-public partnership potential for the building of a road to get it through, at least to push it through if it's being desired by any particular private companies?
yeah, and with many situations, it is a combination of transportation grants, local development contributions. There's a whole host of elements that come into play for that kind of an concept there. So yeah, it'd be a host of things, but certainly some would be City of Bothell transportation mitigation funds. I would sure that would be one of the sources.
And as we're trying to get to kind of transit-oriented development, would pushing these roads through simply delay that desire? Is it simply creating more ways for cars that we don't necessarily want to continue to cut through there? I don't know, is it just kind of like prolonging the problem? Is it just building more roads and not getting to the heart of the issue? I don't know. But I mean, I could see that where at least the two, maybe one or two of them, I don't know about all three, but I would be supportive of what the commission decides either way.
I wasn't at any of the community meetings, so I don't have a good understanding of kind of the pushback, but I'm definitely in favor of continuing to study and dig a little bit deeper. I'm not able to make a decision tonight as whether it's a good or bad decision. So yeah, I would support continuing to look at it.
Is 219th solely for that one employer?
Yeah, they actually have security gates blocking off most of their parking already, and so there couldn't be cut-through traffic because of those security gates.
But the proposal is to open it up for the sole benefit of that employer and their employees.
That very large employer, yes. And there's actually two employers there, Juno and of course Phillips, that would be able to use that as one option for them.
Any potential benefit for the fire department? Isn't the fire station back there as well?
There is a fire station right there, and it could be, and again, one more way for them to get through. I think we'd have to work with Phillips on getting the Opticom system, but they probably would say, yeah, it makes a lot of sense to do that because we want the fire department to come in the back of our building to fight fires back there too. So
Yeah, I would see that as a condition if that opens, that the
Got
fire
it.
department have that access.
Similar benefit on 214th.
fire access.
And, sorry, I stepped out of the room for a minute, so I may be repeating something that you already said, but in response to Chair Vliet's comment, the opening those roads is really to address the level of service. So if we're adding the amount of growth that we're talking about here under any of the scenarios, we don't meet our level of service requirements. So that's why we were looking at opening those roads. It really kind of gets at the last question up there, which is another option is to lower the level of service standard to such a degree that I don't know if we could even get there realistically. I think we'd still be looking at something along those lines, but that's the trade-off that we're talking about.
That makes sense. I think I'd be more willing to add the additional roads than to change our level of service, I think.
Say that again?
I think I'd be more in favor of pushing the roads through, I guess, or trying to continue to study to do that rather than looking to changing the level of service. But we'll see.
I agree, and I think so much of this area, the traffic issues that currently are faced, are problems created outside of, the specific regional growth area that we're looking at. There's a lot of development off of Maltby Road and further north into Mill Creek that influences everything that we're talking about. We're compounding it, but we should look at any and all opportunities to try to relieve what we can.
One of the things that we learned from our transportation consultant is it's about 60% of the traffic is flow through, basically is pass through. It's not generated from the city of Bothell at all, but we'll get that figured for you. But it's a really surprising percentage.
Did you say 6 or 6?
60, sorry. Yeah, it's a large percentage.
I would echo Commissioner Kiernan's comments about 219th, that connection to 9th. For what I heard at the public meetings and just in review of the material provided so far, 214th seems like a pretty heavy lift. And I don't know if if improving the roadway so that vehicle traffic can have access to 9th Avenue is worth it in the long run. But I think that pedestrian and bike connections are certainly a lot easier of a lift there. So I think that's worth pursuing, maybe as a lower standard here than improving it for vehicular access. In general, I think that bike improvements, I always talk about this, but bike improvements are kind of a missing variable from what we've seen so far. And I'd be interested to see what improvements are proposed as part of the bike master plan. But that could have a huge impact. I mean, if you build it, we're maybe not seeing, a lot of bike traffic on Bothell Everett Highway, but if there's improvements that are made to that infrastructure, I'm certain that we would see a response from the community, especially with getting from frequent transit back towards these business parks while working. I think that'd be a pretty easy thing to do, and extending the reach of these, half-mile radii from the transit services. The last comment that I had on that transportation projects was 20th. I think that's pretty easy to do if there's not a lot of pushback from the existing development. I think also we heard from North Shore School District that they were interested in that as an extra route for bus lanes from their barn, depending on traffic from other regional transit facilities in the area. That might also be an important connection for them too.
Yes.
So that's my 2 cents.
I'll add that at that 9th Ave and 214th meeting, there was a lot of support for a bike ped only connection.
Right.
At 214th to 9th.
So I'll add one comment to this. I feel that if we improve 9th, it certainly is going to need the sidewalk and bike lane treatment and some protection for the people that are living there already. But I also don't think that it's going to be effective long term if we pull some drivers off of Bothell Highway and put them on 9th. We're just going to have more drivers added to Bothell Highway. The induced demand is going to be there. I mean, people are already they're still buying homes and still renting apartments north given the current traffic conditions. And as residential that's affordable becomes even more scarce, they're going to be willing to drive even longer commutes, and by longer I mean amount of time. So we're just going to free up that traffic space for more cars unless we make a proactive decision to, let's say, the idea of adding bat lanes. If we added bat lanes to 405, then I think 9th would make a lot more sense. But if we're just going to take capacity from one road and add it to another and then have the traffic come back, it's just a complete waste of effort. And the people in 9th aren't happy, the people on Bothell Highway aren't happy, the bus commuters are still having that. You know, there's two ways to look at that slide. One's there's a current 130-second penalty for every bus rider, and the other way is to look at it as we're going to save them time, but really it's all the cars in front of the bus that are slowing them down, not the buses that are slowing the cars down.
That leads right into this question about modifying the city's corridor level of service standard. What some cities are doing is doing something what they call the ultimate capacity.
Yes.
And just saying, okay, Bothell Everett Highway has reached its ultimate capacity. This is it. We know that it's failing. There's nothing we can do about it. And it gets to your point that, you know, if you were to continue building, it just, more would come. So there's actually, I think, there's a lot of failure that happens even in the mitigated live work. It's better than the action scenarios, but there was still a lot of failure. So what are you all thinking with that?
I don't think that we can build our way out of the congestion on Bothell Highway. So I think the most important factor of the level of service is safety. And if we emphasize safety, then maybe level of service is still valuable. If more people are dying on a road, I mean, Rainier Avenue, right? High speeds, high fatalities. There's a lot of things that could be done and some treatments to improve that. I don't know that we have a lot of fatalities or serious injury collisions on Bothell Highway, and maybe that's because nobody can get over 20 miles an hour.
10 miles an hour.
But to me, that's not a bad thing. If people aren't dying on the roads, that's a good thing.
So change the definition of LOS to be more about safety.
If we wanted
than
to
time.
keep it to weight those, and I don't know if they use the national manuals for level of service or if it's localized, but I know that there's some tweaks where you can weigh level of service as maybe 30% and safety as 30%, and you're doubling that up, and then maybe bike facilities get another 10. I don't know how it's done. It's a bigger conversation than we're going to have tonight. But to answer the question, I don't think that it would be a bad thing to reevaluate whether level of service is the most important thing, because we're never going to hit it. You know, we're never going to hit our aspirational goal. We're going to continue to fail. And if you're failing, no matter what you do, then you need to rethink the whole paradigm.
I think the level of service conversation that we've had so far is maybe through this lens of A through F being a grade, when realistically it's a unit of time measurement for delay. And I think that's colored our opinions a lot. And so that I think if we were able to see how much delay in seconds that actually was, we might be having a different conversation right now too.
I might have that in the backup slides. Yeah, so this was, trying to remember, this is for the three separate intersections and what the delay is for mitigated versus mitigated live work. We do have the analysis that compares existing conditions and the action alternatives, the no action, and then the mitigated. And the mitigated is better than no action. I do remember that, at least in some cases.
I just think that when you're in a car, you know, like a 5-second delay seems like it's the end of the world to some people. But I mean, when you're in a bus, that 5-second delay is for every single person on the bus. And so that is like in minutes rather than seconds. And so if we were to say, instead of saying A through F, establishing at least I don't support level of service at all, but if we were to at least put it in terms of you know, delay rather than just a grade level, I think that could maybe change how the reference is in discussion.
I think it's not just about getting a single occupancy vehicle a distance in an amount of time, and that's the way it's looked at a lot. It's also commerce. You know, there's an economic impact of having delivery vehicle stuff. There's a safety impact. You know, how many times have you seen an emergency response vehicle trying to get through these intersections? So I would be very reluctant to just throw our hands up and say, well, you know, we can't get them through any better. That's all there is. You know, I've seen emergency response vehicles on Bothell Everett trying to make it through that intersection. And we need to address mobility. And maybe they go down the bat lanes.
Yeah,
you know?
I was just gonna say that,
I'm fine with that. You know, there are ways to do it, but to just, you know.
Thank you. I'm hearing an openness to rethinking what LOS means in Bothell. Hearing improved transit. Looking back through my notes, trying to summarize here. Looking at parking and what kinds of other mechanisms we can put in place as well. Limiting parking in front of businesses, you know, knowing that this will be a neighborhood, pre-thinking that before it develops as a neighborhood.
And sorry, on that, just a passing thought on that, which, sorry to interrupt you, and but it would be kind of interesting. There's places in Bothell, especially around Main Street in the area. Like, it'd be really awesome if we had some kind of enforcement mechanism or something like that, and we got away from these parking spaces, these 8 parking spaces are for this paint store or whatever, and then so, you know, it's just not a very good use of those parking spaces. In certain areas. So it'd be nice if they were more flex, if they're like, maybe not taking away, but maybe one small way to get at some of the parking issues is to not make them so restrictive. Now, historically, we'd have to look into that, maybe taking them away from businesses, so that might not be a good thing, but I think it frees up some parking spaces that may be sitting empty almost all day long, right in the most prime area of town. And I think this could also relate to Canyon Park. That's why I talked about Main Street, so.
And general support for reduced parking requirements, thinking long-term on that. The little patch of townhouses, at least changing it to a pink color. Yeah, so at least it's somewhat connected. There was, you know, I got the sense that people are interested in seeing office near I-405, but it seemed pretty split as to whether we should designate it just for office or do a setback for air quality that doesn't allow residential. But it seemed like everybody was interested in seeing office or commercial uses near I-405.
Yeah, I don't mind a lower density residential area. Personally, I just don't want to see, you know, 400 units right there.
And you're talking about the orange area around 228th.
Yeah, I don't mind residential. Okay. It's just, you know, to me, it makes sense maybe to have office space there in a lower office residential requirement.
Okay.
I'm kind of the opposite. I'm personally okay with residential by 228th. We're shoving a bunch of units in where Country Village used to be, which is a little bit more difficult to access. I think this is kind of one of our last remaining close to 405 pieces of property. So I'm personally okay with it.
So I might have misunderstood, and I'm looking for a key or something that shows the distance, but this orange section over here is, I mean, that's 500 feet from 405, right? I thought we were talking about the pink section that was right
think the
around
pink
the
section
405 Bothell Highway corridor.
I know, I really wish I had my scale, but I actually think 500 feet would be still within that pink zone.
Yeah, so it wouldn't touch the orange zone.
I don't believe
my,
so.
My thought is that's more than 500 feet. So if we're talking about the orange, different question, but I think we're
Yeah.
talking about the pink.
Yeah.
And I would be against the 500-foot buffer for a number of reasons. If anything, I would recommend that we make that office only. I don't want to give up that buildable space around the high-capacity transit systems that are going in there. And I wouldn't even be opposed to residential there, but I would prefer office. So, I mean, depending on what other commissioners or what the council has to say or the public, people. We're talking about the pink area here.
Yeah.
So the idea was, do we want to kind of restrict residential there to keep it high-density office? And if so, there's a couple of mechanisms. One, we can demand that it's office. Or two is we can have a 500-foot residential kind of clean air zone around these busy transportation hubs. And the parking
Yeah,
lot's right
Bonefish and
here.
the Hilton then.
Yeah.
The Hilton and then the Outback, okay.
Yeah.
Okay.
When you say residential buffer, you mean a ban on residential, not a residential buffer.
That's my understanding, yeah.
Yeah. Within that distance, there would be no residential allowed, yes.
So
The
you're-
office could.
Opposed to a 500-foot residential ban buffer around 405?
I am. For one of the reasons it's only being considered for this area right here. It wouldn't apply to other parts of the city or other parts of the region. And I just think I would rather the market decide than us to decide on that, but I
Is
would
it a little too
prefer-
site-specific then? It's just in this
That's-
one area?
It's just, this is our high-capacity transit corridor.
No, that
with,
is,
with
okay.
two
yeah.
high-capacity transit lines and stations here, and then we're gonna say 1,000 feet outside of probably 200 feet of right-of-way, we can't have any residential, or we can't. I just think that if we're gonna say we want office, let's say we want office, but don't make this like fake thing up to say we can't have residential there. If the point is to have office, let's just make it office. Let's not spot zone this weird code. Maybe all the vehicles will be electric by 2040, and it won't be a.
I would
congestion
agree
issue.
with the Commissioner Hampton on this point.
I mean, that's just kind of where my mind is. I haven't thought about it for more than 2 hours and 48 minutes, so I don't have all, I'll call you in the morning and let you know, but that's my initial thought.
Rachel, when you say pink, are you talking about just this area, or are you talking about this area as well?
Both of them.
Both of them.
And just for reference, a quarter mile, that radius, that circle, the radius of that is a quarter mile, and a quarter mile is 1,320 feet. So it's a much smaller little band along I-405. So would your dream be that area is a mix of office and residential? Like the idea of keeping it an open zone is that if it's developed, if a large portion of it is developed, the developer could do both, either one. And there could be a lot of benefit of having an office building near 405 and a residential building across the street. If we zone the whole thing office, that couldn't happen. If we did the buffer, that could happen. If you did the mixed zone with no buffer, you could end up with residential right next to 405 and kids with asthma.
So I mean, it's a good point. Think about the kids and think about the opportunity for development there. I think the best developments that we're seeing in the region are a mix of residential and office, maybe not in the same building, but in the same zone.
Yeah.
And so I would advocate for that, but I also don't want to see a bunch of 5/1 residential with maybe some retail in the bottom next to these two significant transit investments. So if the only way we can do that is by demanding that it's office, or I wasn't allowed to be here for the minimum density conversation, so I don't know how that went, but if there was another minimum density
Yeah.
opportunity in this zone, maybe within a quarter mile of the transit or something like that. And then if they wanted to build residential, they'd have to build more residential. But we're not giving up these prime real estate opportunities around transit.
Yeah. And the minimum densities that we're talking about, get us 6+ stories. So what are you envisioning? Or the whole group?
So 6-story residential isn't, I don't think it's
Yeah.
dense enough for those two
Yeah.
connections. I mean, the I-405 BRT is gonna be a people mover, and the Swift line is eventually gonna be a people mover as well. And I see, when I think of a 6-story residential with potentially ground floor retail, I think that's office residential medium, not office residential high. So,
There's a development at Totem Lake, all those, I'd consider that very high. You know what I'm talking about?
By the mall.
Really? Okay.
Yeah, and this comes back to that, do we wait for what we really want, or do we offer what's feasible now? And we have to show to PSRC that there is a feasible path forward. Or we don't maintain the RGC criteria, designation.
They're gonna slap our wrists or put us in regional growth center jail or what?
And then we're not competitive for federal transportation funding.
Right, if the worst-case scenario is we lose our designation as a regional growth center, and then we're not gonna be competitive for the transportation dollars.
So I think back to the first of many questions related to this one area. I definitely want to emphasize office as a potential development standard for this area. I'm okay with not limiting it 100% to office, but I would want to incentivize that option because I think otherwise we're just going to get residential. So, maybe these are larger parcels. I would think that a developer would maybe be incentivized to provide some office in order to enable them to develop some residential so that we can create that mixed use. So some sort of bonus mechanism within our code. But I think if we just leave it open, we've left it open all over the city and we get residential. So why is it going to change?
So I'm hearing a lot of support for office there, high density office at I-405.
And I think if you end up, or if we can find a path that has these parcels having to have both office and residential, the residential would naturally be away from the freeway. I mean, if you're gonna build a building and one side is on the freeway and one side isn't, where are people gonna wanna live? Where's the better place to live? It'd be away from the freeway, one would think.
Well, if both are allowed, the fear is that only residential would come in at all.
Understood.
Yeah.
And I prefaced it with, if we can find a way to have both there,
Yeah.
then I think they would naturally segregate themselves so the residential would be away from the freeway. So that's a challenge.
Bruce and Mike and Andrew, did you hear any other big points that I didn't summarize?
Back to the slide with the questions, just to make sure we've.
Yeah. Oh, we were in the backup slides. Oh,
I think it's,
No,
Go down,
Bruce
go
modified
forward.
your presentation.
I did. I made it bigger.
oops. Here are the transportation ones.
So I think we have answered
Yeah, I think
those.
we got that.
In terms of connections to the surrounding street system, I did hear a lot of different points, but at least keep studying all of them.
Yes.
Well, I think everyone supported 20th. I didn't hear any
Okay.
concerns there.
Yeah, 20th, that's important.
Okay. 214th, maybe look at only a trail.
And if 219th goes through, the emergency vehicles get through.
So there was general support for 219th.
Yes, I think so.
I don't know that I would say I supported it. I would only support it if they did the one lane in each direction of Batlands on Bothell Highway to try to have a real solution. Maybe that would be the mitigation for the existing throughput on Bothell Highway that was lost due to Batlands.
Was that for 219th or
For-
214th?
Either of them, if they're gonna pull,
Okay.
you know, I know that Commissioner Kiernan said that 219th was First Phillips, but anybody that went out the back way would not be going out the front way, so it would help everybody on Bothell Highway, even if they didn't work for Phillips. So if we wanted to put the bat lanes in and not have the level of service reduction because of the bat lanes, if we open those up, it would put people on 9th, more vehicles off of Bothell Highway.
Right.
And then it would be a potential mitigation for that. But I would want to see 9th improve significantly before anything like that happened.
I agree.
Yep.
Agree. Yeah, I did hear that point as well.
Yeah.
We have 3 minutes, so we can either extend the meeting if I have a motion to extend for another 5 minutes, or
Move to extend the meeting for another 5 minutes. To 9:05.
anyone second?
Is that going to be enough time?
Do you need 5 minutes?
We're just summarizing now.
Second.
All's in favor?
Aye.
Aye.
We'll go up to the other set of questions. Just in general, I heard a lot of focus on the long term. Focus on the long term, and waiting is okay.
And I would add, be clear or specific about the land uses.
But without spot zoning, which is the tricky part.
Right.
Okay.
Okay, so if we're through our questions, can I take a motion to close the study session?
You don't need to
Don't need
have a
to, okay.
motion for that.
Old business. Seeing none, reports from staff.
So very briefly, first of all, thank you for the discussion tonight. This was really good. This is what we had hoped for. The next step is the public hearing on your next meeting on March 4th. Thank you. And then I just have two quick things. I did bring copies of the approved docket from the council, so I'll pass those around for your information. I'm happy to answer any questions if you have some. And then also, last meeting, you adopted the bylaws. And one of the things that, one of my pet peeves that I always express to my coworkers in the department is when we miss simple little things and mix it up, like putting the wrong minutes in the packet last time. Well, I did that this time. As I was going through and making all the changes that you had approved in the bylaws, I actually read the last section of the bylaws, which said that you are supposed to receive them 10 days in advance in writing. And I didn't do that, so you will be getting a letter with the bylaws changes, in track changes, 10 days prior to your next meeting, and I'll ask you to adopt them again at that time. So my apologies for that.
Sounds good.
My personal embarrassment at that, but we'll get that fixed. So that's all I had on staff reports. Thank you.
Thank you. Any reports from members? You've been cut off.
They need to do that. It's less than 30 seconds. Director Cotterman, I have a really quick question on the code amendments to Title 14, the first one on the list. It was postponed from March. I've had some people asking me when we'll have a study session on the critical areas ordinance. Is that going to be in the spring, or are we pushing it off quite some time?
That's a great question. We are We're working on getting our contracts finalized with the consultants, on getting that work going. So I'm hoping we'll come to you at least with an initial introduction to what we're doing, possibly at one of the March meetings, but I would say April. We'll start the discussion. I'll say we'll probably get into it more in the second quarter.
Makes sense.
Thanks
Thank
for
you.
the question.
I think that's all. Thank you to Andrew and Rachel and for all of the information tonight. It was great to walk through Canyon Park. Do I have a motion to adjourn?
Move to adjourn.
Second.
All in favor?
Aye.
Aye.